Prester's Tower, an Elsewhere Story by Angelee Sailor Anderson. Read by Stanley Anderson. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Job, chapter 38, verse 31. First scribble. The verse. It means what it means. Match, are we ready? Oh, I crypt that you've been ready since afore you came HITH from the Sancti Mount. Your wings are tickling my cheek, and your hot breath is asking, sarcastic-wise, specially, are you ready? You've been trying to escape this by brining over it, account of it is so portentous, and you feel you're being vanity to even think of scribbling. But the 4 younger Sibs aren't your task now, since your head's gone as muddy as your hair. This is your task. You've got the benet of your Matt and your Pat, and the rest of your fam. I've been whispering start, start, start through the last few moons agone. In the name of the bell-ringer himself, do even you know what you're waiting for? Slow is better than no, Match, but you know as well as I that I'm waiting for my twin. I'm waiting for Prester. I need to know he'll read this over the shoulder you're not perched on. This scribble is his more than mine. This scribble. I am scribbling, and a fine poison stink I'm making of it. You don't fash a story by wondering if you're ready and scribbling about that. You fash it by telling it. I'm ruinating this already. And there I go brining some more. Memorial me again. What is the story, Match? I know I need to tell about Matt and Pat's GRANDFAMs, and how our fam came to Blue Flower, and how we live HITH, and what all the Sibs are like, especially Prester, even though he's elsewhere. And I need to tell about the verse, kind of that's the key to cripping the why of everything, and maybe cripping something about what the fam, me mainly, are meant to do next. But Matt says you can't mean until first you are, any more than the verse can. Matt says if you want to begin something hard, look at with you are, even if you can't look at who. So with am I. Sitting in the morning dews, my particular bespringing things, though they're so unparticular that they grow everywith between the twin rivers, unless they're tamed, which was my task afore Muddyhead. Listening to the twins is behind everything else. Never was a time in my memorial that I didn't hear their water running. Hearing the bell that Pat fashed to sing in the wind, same as the bigger bell on Prester's Tower. Seeing Pat's particular bewinged thing, great blue heron, perched atop our habitat, and behind that, and up, seeing the Sancti Mount, and on top of that, with its arms reaching higher than any of us can see, the Psi Tree. If I had my brother Con's eyes, I could even see the stars, account of he doesn't need the night to do it in. And the stars are very like the verse, only up above. I've memorialed with I am, now with am I getting to? The why of me scribbling this is that I'm hoping my eyes will recognize whatever it is when I get thith. The verse is a map, Matt says. You won't know width on the map you are till thith you are. And if I was in danger of not memorialing the verse, you'd tail-lash it into my thoughts, Match, waking and dreaming, like there was nothing else to memorial. I wish I could unmemorial it and rest a little time and again, but I can't, so HITH it is, as Matt was taught it, and then brought it to her GRANDFAM to the rest of us. She didn't scribble it, though. She says it oughtn't need to be scribbled. Misery me that I am scribbling it. There'll be a star. There'll be an unmated queen. There'll be a cottage on a moor. There'll be a cave in a wood. There'll be a black horseman and a blue flower. There'll be something scarlet. There'll be a room hung in green. There'll be a crooked town and a castle twisted. There'll be a prisoner and a pair of ram-hide boots. There'll be a dying animal. There'll be a lullaby. There'll be white wings, and only then, and then only, Prester's Tower. Only then, and then only. I wonder when then is. It's truth, Match. It hurts when you laugh in my ear. I see I should have started with the verse, shouldn't I? Prester understands. He crips that I can't get anywhere direct without mossy gathering first, account of I'm missing his half of me. Prester understands. I assump that means he can hear me, maybe even read his own name over my shoulder. So it is time to start. Except, no, I've got to breathe first. Breathe twice. Breathe thrice. Breathe times 4. Breathe times 5. There, I've done the 14, which means I'm as on the ground as I'll ever be. Match, am I ready? Second Scribble. Matt's GRANDFAM, finding the stars down HITH and following them. The various thing about Matt's GRANDFAM is that it really was a fam. I can't crip whether something about them made them able to live like that, or whether deciding to live like that made a fam of them. Every one of them had a task, but no one told them to do it. Even as little ones, they seemed to find it for themselves, and somehow everything that needed doing got done. They chose their own wearing cloth colors when they reached a certain age, which were as various as the colors of their eyes and hair, and no one seemed to think their colors were any more fair than anyone else's. They each had particular bespringing things they chose for themselves to wear about their heads or their waists on feast days. There was sometimes a bit of poison stink among them, every once in a while an outright pride child, but they mostly sorted themselves out, and the pride children wandered off of their own accord, being too vanity to stay part of the fam. Southwise of them were other GRANDFAMs. These they traded with for needful things they couldn't find near their own habitat. There were branching rivers down HITH, none too deep to be forded, and there were strange new bespringing things and critters. Matt says she never went HITH till she and Charter and FATHOM and CONIFER and Pat and I fled to Blue Flower. And she says she wasn't feeling strong enough then to mind a lot of what was about her. Account of our fam started south right after Prester and I were birthed, and Matt was nursing me. But Prester had gone with he didn't need any nursing. Westwise of Matt's GRANDFAM was the sea. Rarely did they go HITH, but they believed their first fam had come from HITH aforetime and agone. Between their habitat and the sea were long waving grasses like beautiful lady hair, and the grasses leaned seaward whichever way the wind blew. Sometimes salty critters would visit from HITH, bringing them gifts from the beachy places, sometimes maybe even from the sea itself. Northwise, as far as they could see to west or east, were mountains. Matt's GRANDFAM didn't call them sancti like we do our own in Blue Flower, but they were in awe of the mountains, and they never did trespass on them. Unlike Pat's GRANDFAM, they never cut mountain stones. They said what the mountains gave of their own accord, the stones that rolled down to the heathery places beneath, were all they needed. There were wild horses on the mountains, always running and running like that was their only task. From the highest mountain, just to the east, there poured a great river, the Starflood. It flowed straight south, they supposed, finally into more of the sea. It was too strong to be forded except in one place near Prester's tower. But they never crossed it, nor did folks cross from the other side, not until way later. Account of the flood's waters were so strong it was a danger to go too near them, so the GRANDFAM took their water from a fount that sprang near the foot of the tower. The fount bubbled up golden by day, and burst silver blue by night. It was the fairest natural thing they knew of, and the sanctiest. After spawning time, the fish that swam in the flood would throw themselves onto the western bank, knowing it was time for them to go elsewhere. Then for a while Matt's GRANDFAM would gather them and have meat food and feel stronger for it. But the fam never went catching of fish any more than they took stones out of the mountains. In the meadowlands studded with wildflowers that surrounded their habitats, they cleared space for the planting and tending of grains and vegetables and herbs and fruits. They kept tame critters that seemed to want to be kept, goats for milk and cheese, sheep for wool, and the eggs of bewinged things that weren't full of young they collected and ate. Or, as they said, the bewinged things laid for them. Even the wilder critters about HITH were half tame. The GRANDFAM didn't kill critters for food or hide, as they knew some fams did, nor account of they thought it pride child, but they had more joy in critters themselves than any other need of them. They had tools for fashioning and growing, but no weapons. It didn't come natural to them to think much beyond their present tasks and joys. They knew letters that they all scribbled a bit, and sometimes told stories, but their stories were mostly for the ear. They had no instruments of music, but they all sang, though not in words. They had their own sayings. Slow is better than no, when they didn't feel like hurrying. Roll a mean stone rolls back on you, and that was a fire of your own kindling, speaking of their own or others' mistakes. In their own vocab, things hard to crip were called dark sayings, and things easy to be cripped, doxologies. They kept their tempers and calmed their fears by taking 14 deep, slow breaths. They didn't go far from their particular habitats at night, and rarely out of them till morning-wise. They laughed, but mostly their gladness was too full for that. They passed a lot of their time in being still. The fam's particular habitats were of wood and thatch and the few stones the mountains gave them. They never fashed anything with sharp corners, but curved all the turnings and all the doors and windows, and they fashioned natural arches leading from one part of their outside habitat to another. All the shapes they fashioned came from patterns they saw in the stars. Come time for a new Matt and Pat to set up their own particular habitat, they would study the stars carefully till they found the right plan. They saw their whole lives aground as mirroring something that was above, and since above was an elsewhere place and sanctity, they felt they had nothing to fear while they kept the connection. There were 2 star groups that were specially pretentious to them. They called the first the bell ringer, account of whenever he rested himself right over Prester's tower, the tower bell would ring all of itself for a while, even if the night air was still. Otherwise the bell rang a little or a lot or not at all according to the winds. The tower and its bell were already thith when Matt's GRANDFAM came over the sea. It seemed to be fashioned from the stone of the mountain from which the Starflood fell, and though the bell might have been mountain metal, it didn't look to have been fashioned at all. When Matt's GRANDFAM came, there was a lady who lived in the tower, last of some GRANDFAM that had all gone elsewhere maybe, or maybe she came from elsewhere herself. She took them for her own GRANDFAM and taught them their letters, and searched the stars for them, and helped them to live more like a fam than ever they had. She didn't seem of any particular age, though they thought she must have been already very old, account of it didn't seem she was with them long. Her wearing cloth was white, and she was never a Matt or wed with a Pat. Her one task was to be the lady of the tower. Matt's GRANDFAM called it the Lady Tower then. The tower lady taught them the names of many things they had no name for, but especially the names of the 10 sanctity stars. The 7 Sibs she called CONIFER, PRESTER, PENNYDANCE, CARRYWISH, FONDEST, RIGHTFUL, and MARY-AGO. But the 3 stars in the ringer's waist, girding him, as it might be, with a bell rope, she called Charter, Fathom, and between them what she called the Bell Star, specially. So that's with my name and the rest of my Sibs came from. Happened finally that the lady went elsewhere. From then onward, afore much time agone, a girl of the fam would feel it was her task to be the next lady, and the rest of the fam seemed to recognize it too. So she, only among the fam, would take white for her wearing cloth color. And she'd never have a husband or children, but she would spend her nights listening to the stars and repeating what they said to the GRANDFAM. They thought of her like a queen, but only because she was closer than they to above and elsewhere. She never really ruled them, but helped them to rule themselves, and the last lady they had went elsewhere about the same time as Matt was birthed, and they waited and kept the tower ready, but no other lady came. They grieved for that, yet never left off waiting and hoping. I've meant to tell about Matt as well as her GRANDFAM, but truth is, I don't crip much particular about her apart from them. I know her task was to fash cloth and savory food, and she was skilled in letters and singing. Her particular wearing cloth color was blue like mine. Her particular bespringing thing was lavender, and she seems to memorial it sadly somehow, but she still loves it, and we gather it for her from the little patch that grows on the west side of the Sancti Mount. She didn't have a particular bewinged thing, any more than the rest of her GRANDFAM did, before our journey to Blue Flower. Then came Gyrfalcon to her, Great Blue Heron to Pat, Golden Eagle to Charter, Stormy Petrel to Fathom, and Boreal Owl to Con. Prester was already gone when they came. I was thith, right enough, but no particular bewinged thing came to me. Fact is, I do know one story about Matt when she was younger, just my age. Of course her name wasn't Matt then, account of she wasn't one, but what her name was she hasn't told me. This story is so magnific, so not like on the ground, that we call it an elsewhere story. Everyone in my fam has one like that. The twins have one between the 2 of them, except for me. My fam says it doesn't matter if my bespringing thing isn't particular, and if I don't have a particular bewinged thing, or didn't, afore match, that is. And if I don't have an elsewhere story, account of I have something the rest of them don't. I can't crip what they think it is. Maybe my scribbling is me trying to find my elsewhere story. Prester doesn't have one either that I know of. He only lived a few minutes. Really, his whole story is elsewhere. Anyway, this is Matt's elsewhere story. When she was 12, One night she went to the sancti fount for water, not a time usual for the fam, but Matt was always a little different in that way, and others. She got to looking up at Prester's tower, or the Lady Tower as it was then. It seemed sad to her that there hadn't been a lady for 12 years, and she thought maybe if she went up into the tower she could try to ask someone, maybe the bell-ringer himself, to bring her GRANDFAM a lady. So she went in the arched door, which was never locked. She knew she oughtn't to without someone's benet, but she somehow felt like she had someone's, though she didn't know whose, and she walked up the stairs that wound till she came to the top where the bell was. She stroked the bell rope, and it made her whole body tingle, but she took care not to let the bell ring. She looked out of the arched window facing the sancti fount and the GRANDFAM's habitat and toward the sea that she had never seen. And she said to someone, whether aloud or not, I don't know, "Send my fam a lady. The land between the Starflood and the mountains and the sea and the southern rivers need one." Matt says at that moment the bell-ringer came into his place right above the tower, and she could see the specialty star shining down through the scalloped sky window. She says that the bell started ringing, and the light of the bell star turned solid into another set of winding stairs leading right up above. After, she doesn't memorial how long, the bell-ringer took her hand. Really took it. She says he was the most magnific man she'd ever seen or imagined, except that he was something more than a man. She gave her heart to him right then, and knew right then that she didn't need to be a Matt belonging to any Pat, account of from now on she was too much belonging to the bell-ringer. After he took her hand, he took her journeying. But she says when you're among them, the stars aren't like we see them HITH, though they still show like bright flowers against a deep blue field. Fifth, the bell-ringer was a shining being rather than a group of stars. And just like Matt's GRANDFAM saw things on the ground reflecting the starways, so the things in places above reflected things on the ground. Matt says she saw something fifth, like the sancti fount and the habitat of her fam, but then the ringer led her all the way to the western sea and over it. And the sea was full of boats like what her GRANDFAM must have traveled in when they came east. And there were sea critters, huge and small, and colors she had no more name for than for the critters, and some of the fish, gilded ones, were bewinged. And on the other side of the sky sea there was a sky land, and she knew it must be something like the land aground beyond our western sea. This she saw rare land critters, dogs and dragons and bears and camelopards and lions, and rarer still, horned and flying horses, and rams with a fleece of gold, and half-man, half-horses, and bewinged things that had never yet come east and never will. And thith were a king and a queen that were twins, and the king held a cup that Matt drank of, and the queen had hair that was like a world all in itself, so that you could travel in it. And the king and the queen had musical instruments not known our side of the sea, and they had something to look through that would let them see far off to the most sancty places. And the bell-ringer took Matt even to those places. She doesn't memorial anything about them, except that while she was with, she heard the verse. Up until she told me this, I had thought that the verse was something handed down among her GRANDFAM, maybe from the first tower lady. But no, it was given in particular to Matt to give to the rest of us. She spent the whole journey back to the stairs above the Lady Tower, saying the verse over and over to herself, so she would always memorial it. But at last, and it broke her heart, she says, she had to let go the hand of the bell-ringer and climb back down the winding sky stairs to the Lady Tower, and then down to the tower, and then down the tower stairs to the bottom and back out the arched door, and to the sancti fount, and to her particular habitat, and the bell was still ringing of its own accord, so she knew that little time as we know it must have passed while she was journeying. But she knew it had been a real journey, and her heart was full of the bell-ringer, and she had the verse. When Matt told me this elsewhere story, not long ago, account of I was getting to the age when it happened to her, and to her that seemed the best time for the telling, I asked, "Then did the bell-ringer or one of the other sancti folk grant your wish for a lady?" Matt seemed at the point of answering, but she didn't, at least not direct. She smiled sort of, and looked sad sort of. What she said was, "You'll crip more about the lady when you need to. I don't expect that will be long from now." Third Scribble. Pat's GRANDFAM, making everything even. Pat's GRANDFAM named things otherwise than Matt's did, and even when they named them the same, it was like another vocab. To Matt's GRANDFAM, the great river to the west of them was the Starflood. To Pat's, the same river to the east of them was the Stoneflood, account of it came down from the stony mountain. Matt's GRANDFAM thought most things that were at all were fair, by which they meant both beautiful and as they should be. Pat's GRANDFAM crept the word fair to mean something different. Pat thinks some pride-child thing must have happened to affright his fam aforetime and agone. They had a dread of not keeping everything in order, by which they meant just so and vice versa, but nothing in between. They mostly wore hides, and that mostly rams, but they got cloth from folks in the eastern wood, and it was all gray, and from that they fashioned their cloaks that they wore over all. This sounded magnific to me when I first heard it, account of gray is Matt and Pat's particular color, and I thought then everyone in that GRANDFAM was like a Matt and a Pat. But Pat says Matt's gray cloth is more like silver, whereas his GRANDFAM's was as near as it could come to no color at all. And he says they had no fams with Matts and Pats, account of once children were weaned, which was done sooner rather than later. Children became part of the GRANDFAM only, and mostly none of them ever knew birthwise who their Matt or Pat had been. They all had tasks, but they didn't find them of themselves. They were given them by the elders, and giving tasks and making things even was the elders' task. Everyone took a turn at doing every task, even if they were bad at it. And if they were especially good at it, they'd be assigned a different task mighty quick, account of the unevenness caused by the especialness. They were named for their tasks, from the eldest to the newest. So if one of them was the eldest charged with mining in the mountains, he was the first miner, and if one were the second eldest to be charged with hunting, he would be the second hunter. Their main tasks were to hunt and to tan hides, to quarry and stone cut, to mine and shape metal, to work in wood, and to fashion habitats. Pat's GRANDFAM grew nothing a purpose, only gathered what they found, mostly eastward towards and in the wood. They fashioned all their habitats very exact, very sharp-cornered, and they didn't tolerate strange shapes. Even the instruments they made, which were all hitting things, were fashioned all the same, and their music was a sort of chanting without melody, whose only variance was in the tone of each hitting thing or voice. Any harmony it had came from the GRANDFAM doing it together, but never from anything any one of them tried that was new. They didn't choose particular bespringing things. Things sprang for them to eat or to avoid if they were poisonous, but not to look at the beauty of or breathe the sense of. They scribbled, but only to keep records of practical things, not like the verse. Their weapons, which they took special heed to, though they only used them to stand guard or hunt, were all the same. The bells they forged for timekeeping and calling folk from one task to the next were all the same. Even the color of their hair and eyes were all the same, account of they always married close kin. In Pat's GRANDFAM, if a boy was birthed, then a girl would need to be birthed before the next boy, account of every man or woman ought to have a mate. When extra girls and boys came up by accident, the elders took them to be servers who would never have mates of their own. And if a Matt and Pat had either too many children or too many boys or girls in a row, then they were shunned as being not like folks and given the worst of the tasks. And if they still failed to keep things even, Pat says that in the hardest times they disappeared. The elders might have known how or with, but the rest of the GRANDFAM never did, and that too made them afraid. Pat crypts the disappearing was something to do with the castle and the town in the mountains to the north, east of the Stoneflood mountain, but west of the wood. Messages seemed sometimes to go back and forth from the elders to those places, but all most of the GRANDFAM knew about it was that at whiles a black horse would go between with someone astride of it. Seems the mountain dwellers had tamed some of the wild horses that Matt's GRANDFAM saw always a-running. I've asked Pat what the castle and the town were like, and he says only the miners and quarriers got near enough to see them to tell of, and I've asked him whether he ever did, but he doesn't seem to want to talk about it. Another thing about Pat's GRANDFAM is that they didn't think of anything as sanctity, which is to say they didn't think of anything with awe. Things just were what they were, and didn't point to things above. But they had a few customs that not even the elders could explain, that Pat thinks may have come from old sanctity times. They collected all the ashes of their fires, and at a feast once a year they buried them in the earth, to the music of their sticks and drums. Most marriages were made by the elders, but if a man had a special liking for a woman and couldn't bear to be parted from her, he could cast his cloak about her and present her to the elders, and elders couldn't say him nay. Afterward that man and woman were not considered like folks. They were usually the ones that birthed too many or the wrong kind of children. So less of their children than those of the others were allowed to become Mats and Pats. A few of them tried to run away, but whether any ever managed to escape from the elders or the mountain horsemen, Pat can't say. Now Pat was never like folks. From the time he can remember, he liked looking at the stars, which his GRANDFAM mostly ignored, and he liked the bespringing things, and he liked to fash things different and better. He even fashed a wind instrument of wood that made an actual melody until the elders took it away. He loved the eastern woods and the majesty of the northern woods and the open lands and rivers to the south, and especially he loved the Stoneflood to the west. His GRANDFAM didn't trust the flood, and one of their tasks was to keep watch over it near the fording place. Pat always wished that task was his, but when he was 9 he was caught wandering tasklessly among the fountain grass and ruby grass and the horsetails and papyrus and gazing at the white lilies that grew in a still pool by the ford. Pat says something sancty seemed to call him thith that day, and he peered across the flood, knowing in his heart that the call had come from the other side. He says he almost set foot into the ford, but the flood watcher, who dwelt in the moor cottage, spied him. Unlike with tasks, there was only ever one watcher at a time. The watcher didn't seem angry or inclined to give a hummel about why Pat shouldn't be thith, but he took Pat back most of the way to the GRANDFAM's habitat, and he told Pat it would be wisest not to wander floodwards again any time soon. So Pat grew up bitterer and bitterer at the elders and the GRANDFAM in general, of how when you'd say something they hadn't heard afore, they'd answer, "You hang on nothing," or how if you tried a new way of doing a thing, they'd say, "That can't scan." And the older he got, the more he realized that most of the elders didn't care for the GRANDFAM as much as they let on. And they didn't always follow the rules they laid down either. They traded mates, or took more than one sometimes. They didn't mind how many and what children they had, but strange to tell, though they allowed themselves to have as many as they liked, they never had that many. By the time Pat was 17, he thought of running away. He wasn't so much sick of doing his tasks as he was sick of not being able to do them as best he could. He was sick of the evenness, and how every time anyone asked why something was happening or had happened, the answer was always, "'Cause is," or "'cause was," and get your head out of the morning dew and quit asking. He thought if he heard any of those one more time he would lie down and die. When Pat was 17, the elders set him to the task of hunting. Pat had dreaded that a-coming all his life, account of he would rather have made friends with the critters than eat them or wear their skins. And that is when his elsewhere story happened. He was in the eastern woods thinking, "I can hunt, or I can run away right now and hope to escape the elders, for a day at least." But on a sudden, a heart leapt toward him out of the trees, and in shock and without really meaning it, he held out his spear and caught it in the breast. It cried out and lay down so slowly and sadly, and so resigned to die, that Pat, who hated himself for wounding it, thought he might as well die along with it. He held its head in his lap and brined, and said, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And after this had gone on for what seemed like always, the heart spoke to him. Pat says its voice wasn't like a man's, but it used man's vocab, and Pat cripped it was the most sancty sound he had ever heard. "You mustn't die with me," the heart said. "I have a task for you." Then the heart told Pat that the flood watcher was going elsewhere, and that Pat would be the next watcher, and that he, the heart, along with Pat's mat, would make it so that the task didn't change. Pat wondered how this could be, though when he stopped to think, he realized that the last flood watcher had kept his task on and on. But Pat was more wondering about the mention of his mat. He didn't know who his mat was any more than the rest of the GRANDFAM did. And the heart told him that his mat was the first mate of the first elder, who had taken her away from Pat's Pat after Pat was born. If Pat hadn't been so astonished, this would have made him bitterer than ever. But just then a messenger from the GRANDFAM found him, and summoned him to the gathering hall with the first elder sat, and the first elder gave Pat the task of flood watcher. Pat could hardly hear him for the fact that his eyes fixed on the first elder's lady. She smiled at Pat. Then he was sent off to the moor cottage to take up his task. And Pat came to crip the flood and everything in it, and the stars above it better than the sound of his own voice. And he'd gaze across the ford and see the sun and moon glimmering on some other water, and something tall with no corners at all that seemed to have a bell sound come from it when the winds were right, or even when the stars were in a certain place. He lived in the Moore cottage alone, except for a lizardy critter similar to Match, but without wings. He reported at times to the GRANDFAM, but they soon seemed to forget about the fact that he was HITH. He was flood watcher for 9 years, and nothing changed except the flood, which was always changing. But Pat didn't mind that kind of evenness. And once, he says, when those years were nearly all war, he had a visit from the first elder's lady. She told him the first elder had gone elsewhere, and that the former second elder was now the first, and that she hadn't a task any more and was too tired for one. But she had come afore she too should go elsewhere to tell Pat his name. Now Pat was 9 years older than when the heart spoke to him about his Mat, and what his Mat said to him now filled him with even greater wonder. As I've told, his only name as far as he knew was the Flood Watcher, and afore that the 5th Hunter, and afore that the 3rd Corner Squarer, and afore that he doesn't memorial which stretcher of hide over drums. His Mat said, "You were given a name in secret, as with many of the not-like folks among the GRANDFAM. Your name is the same as your Pat's name, just as your task is the same as his task. The man that brought you back safe from the ford when you were 9 and who went elsewhere 9 years ago was your Pat, and his name was Orion." Then with the gift of his name, the lady, for so he couldn't help thinking of her, gave Pat the flute that he had fashioned that had been taken from him by the elders. She kissed him and left the Moore cottage, whether back to the GRANDFAM or somewhith off alone, till it was time for her to go elsewhere. Pat never saw her again except in his dreams. When he dreams of her, she tells him things not meant for many ears, so if he's told them to me, I can't tell them again nor scribble them, account of their sanctity. Fourth Scribble. How we sleep, and with I especially fit in. You know, Match, telling the stories of Mat and Pat and Scribble is making me wonder about some things. Things in their stories that I've heard for always seem more portentous now. I haven't cribbed why yet, but the specially star and the tower lady and how all her tasks were to be that, so she was never any other kind of Mat. And then in Pat's story, the place with the flood watchers dwelt, and the town and castle from which the Pride Child horsemen came, and what Pat's GRANDFAM wore, and the heart Pat didn't mean to kill. Things too close are hard to see, but now you're backing up a little? Is that what you're saying? And what have I been closest to all my life? The verse. Why, the verse is all over the place in their stories. I've always assumed the verse was about things as were going to happen, and maybe it still is, but it sure seems like a good bit of them have already. There'll be a star. Could that be the specially star that led Mat up to the sancty places? There'll be an unmated queen. The tower lady, maybe? What comes next? There'll be a cottage on a moor. The flood watcher's moor cottage. There'll be a cave in the wood. That hasn't come into this scribble yet. There'll be a black horseman. Apparently more than one, come from the town and castle to the north of Pat's GRANDFAM. Then what? A blue flower, something scarlet, a room hung in green. There'll be a crooked town and a castle twisted. Don't know about the crooked and twisted part. Wonder if they're the same places. And the ramhide boots in the verse. Pat's GRANDFAM wore a ramhide. Could the dying animal in the verse be a ram, or Pat's heart? How muddy has my head got, anyway? I need to ask Mat. I need to talk to Pat, too, afore I scribble on. Stop! Do the 14 and ground yourself again, specially. Thanks, Match. Yes, I memorial that when I told Mat I wanted to scribble this, but felt I didn't know enough, she said, "Scribble what you do know, and you may learn some more." Seems like I am already. No, I can't ask to be told more till I've told the rest of what I know. Back to WHITH I am, and on from HITH. Just as when I started scribbling, I'm sitting among the morning dews, with Match on my shoulder. Maybe I should tell how the morning dews got their name. Morning dew to Mat's GRANDFAM meant dreamy or imagining, and it wasn't a bad thing to have your head thith unless it got in the way of tasks. To Pat's GRANDFAM it meant you've still got sleep in your eyes and you'd better wake up account of your thinking about things that hang on nothing and can't scan, and how do you expect to mind your corner squaring and your hide stretching and... One of the things I don't crip yet is how Mat and Pat came together, and the why of them, and Charter and Fathom and Con and me coming south. When they did come, they didn't have a clear notion of whither they were going. They were following the flood as guide, though, and one day they saw the sanctity mount afore them with the side tree atop it, and the flood running straight through it. They didn't think they could safely go that way, especially with 4 young ones, and me, a baby in Matt's arms. They figured if they stuck as close to the mount as they couldn't stray far from the flood, so they turned to the right and hugged the west side of the mount till they got to the south side with the flood came out again. When they got thith, they saw the flood split into twin rivers, shallow and calm enough in that place to be forded, and every width between the rivers were strange wild-growing flowers of a color so near that of the sky above on a clear but not too bright day that they thought maybe the whole world had turned upside down. It was the most as it should be, that is to say fair, thing they had ever looked on, and for a time, till they got themselves grounded again with the 14, they thought they were dreaming. So since they had no ready name for those flowers, they called them morning dews, and they called the place between the twin rivers Blue Flower. And then Matt and Pat stopped their journeying and made a habitat. There'll be a black horseman and a blue flower. The blue flower! The verse again! Specially, there won't be a blue flower or any of the rest of it, not in this scribble anyway, unless you quit wandering off into places that aren't your now task. How we live in Blue Flower is one of the things I need to tell about now. All right, then, I will. First, I'll tell how our fam spends its nights. Night has always been my most happy time. Maybe account of Prester and me being born at night, or maybe account of I can't feel guilty for dreaming at a time when I know that's what I'm supposed to be doing. The wood and thatch particular habitat Pat built for us, not far below what the flood comes out of the sanctity mount and splits into the twin rivers, is on 2 levels. The below level is what we do our inside tasks, such as cloth fashing and meal fashing, and in Matt's case, scribbling. I mostly scribble outside. And with we have our fires and our times of making music and storytelling, and with we talk everything out among ourselves about the day agone and the day to come and how our tasks are going, and anything else on our minds. Pat fashed the habitat as he knew Matt would like it. No sharp corners, and all the windows and doors arched. In fact, he's made outdoor arches HITH and THITH all over Blue Flower, so we feel like we've got a whole bunch of worlds to walk into, even though our habitat isn't nearly so big as either of the GRANDFAMs were. Anyway, on that below level, Matt and Pat sleep. And thith, all of us Sibs from me on down have slept till we're weaned at about age 3, and after that we go aloft. There's nothing fancy about aloft, account of it's meant only for sleeping. It's all like one big crosswise bed with little spaces between bunks, and there's 9 of those, 1 for each of us. Aloft faces south, and we sleep in berth order from west to east. Charter, and next Fathom, then Conifer, then me, except if Prester weren't elsewhere, it would have been him next to Con and me next to Prester. Then to my east is PENNYDANCE, next to her CARRYWISH, then FONDEST and her twin RIGHTFUL, and furthest along the row of us, MISERYME, who just came aloft from below a couple of moons past. The bunks are all lined underneath with soft things, and the things that cover us are soft, and we're always warm enough, but never too warm, account of how Pat fashed it in relation to the fire and the sun and all. The only windows are sky windows in the curved ceiling. Rain can't get through them, but through them we can see the stars. There's a perch at the head of each of our bunks for our particular bewinged things. Charter's eagle, Fathom's petrel, Con's owl, and my perch was empty till about the same time as Mariago came aloft, which is when Match came. And PENNYDANCE's mockingbird has its perch, and CARRYWISH's mourning dove, and the twins Finch and Phoebe. Only we're not sure which particularly belongs to which of them, account of those 2 birds are always switching perches, and if FONDEST and RIGHTFUL know themselves, they think it's more fun not to tell. And Mariago has her hummingbird, who perches stilly for longer than you'd imagine such a critter would. We come aloft at different hours as is proper to our ages. I think Con, who would prefer to be out late, comes early a purpose, account of he knows how I depend on him for comfort. But for some space every night, the 9 of us are thith together, and that's when we all sleep best. By we, I guess I particularly mean me. Somehow I can't quite settle proper till every one of us is in his place, and knowing that Matt and Pat are themselves asleep below. Time I like best next to sleep is when it's getting close to sleep time down below, and Matt's busy with ornamenting her cloths, singing the while, and Pat is playing his flute, and one of us Sibs will wander in and sit by the fire and maybe tell something rare he or she has seen or thought of during the day. And then one by one, from youngest to eldest, but sometimes more than one of us together if we're in the mood, the the Sibs will climb aloft to coziness and peace. The fam's days, well, there's no need for me now to go into all the Sibs' tasks and bespringing things and what they look like. They've all got their own scribbles coming up. But this is probably the time to scribble about Matt and Pat and me. Pat's and Matt's tasks are really the whole fam's, they have to teach the rest of us. But Pat fashes in wood and smithies and does the heavy tending and the bespringing things in blue flower. And he trades across both the star and the stone, as we call our west and east rivers, for things we can't get HITH, and in turn takes to the fams across the rivers things they can't get THITH. Clever things he's fashed, and bespringing things that seem to do best HITH of any with. Charter goes with him, and sometimes Fathom too, so they're the only ones of us who see other folk much except to wave at them across the water. Pat, like all his GRANDFAM, has black hair and warm brown eyes, and just enough of a beard, and smiles just enough, and smells just enough of sweat and the fermented grain he drinks and wood shavings and smithy smoke. Matt has deep red hair and blue eyes, and if singing too much is possible, she does it, while she cloth fashes and meal fashes and tends her special things in our close-to-the-habitat garden. She smells like lavender and clean wind and cool water, and this doesn't scan, I know, but she smells like starlight. She always has her gerfalcon with her, unless he's gone over a river to feed, and Pat's great blue heron is always perched atop our habitat when Pat's HITH, and flies along with Pat when he goes to trade. And the heron, like the falcon, goes off seaward to feed sometimes, as also do golden eagle and stormy petrel and boreal owl. That memorials me that I haven't scribbled yet why those birds need to go off to feed. Strangest thing of all about blue flower, stranger than how magnific the bespringing things HITH grow, and how they were growing HITH without tending afore we came, and how the weather is never too extreme on one end or the other, and how the side tree, which we think has no top, watches over us all from the sancty mount. That strangeness is, there's no critters HITH, except ourselves, without wings, none that go only on the ground. So what I know of ground critters I really only know from heretell, unless they're the kind that sport along with water things in the twin rivers, though I do sometimes see others at a distance across the water. We have more bewinged things in blue flower than I can count. Not just birds, but flutterbys and moths and ladybirds and dragonflies and tiny gauzy winged things and big copper-green beetles and bumbler bees both large and small and bewinged things that come alight in the dark. We don't have meat, and don't bring it in either, and we don't have milk except Matt's when we're weaned, and we don't have butter. But Pat sometimes brings us cheese from over the rivers for a treat. We have some egg-laying birds that do it like those Matt memorials from her GRANDFAM, not at our bidding, but they seem to want to. And the bewinged things that are HITH, except the 5 particular ones that came from outside, never leave blue flower, but are born HITH and go elsewhere from HITH. Did you come from within blue flower or from outside, Match? Or maybe from elsewhere? I know it's not time to tell of you yet, except it's time to tell about me, and you're my particular bewinged thing. I always think the main thing about me is that I'm a twin, as isn't no more. But that's a longer story than I know yet. My task is to watch out for my 5 younger Sibs, and a deal of watching some of them take, especially PENNYDANCE and RIGHTFUL. That task takes me all over blue flower, from the foot of the sancty mount, but never on it. We don't any of us climb it. Through all the grains and the herbs and the vegetables and the flowers we tend, and those we don't, and along both rivers, and even sometimes, though none of us 6 youngest are allowed to go thith, except alongside Matt and Pat, to wit the rivers run into the sea. Oh, I do have one other task that takes me all over blue flower, even to the walls of our particular habitat and up them, to keep the morning dews in check. We love having them all about, but they love wandering even with they ought not to go, like down into the rivers and intruding into our tended growing places, and winding up trees and over Pat's work things. I've even caught them trying to sneak into the habitat through the sky windows and the chimney. I'm not supposed to think this about my particular bespringing things, but sometimes they make me madder than the Sibs when they're stubborn, and even madder than I make myself, they're so wild. Not wilder than my hair, though. What do I smell like, Match? Anything? Like the morning dews? But they've got no smell. If they did, we'd all die of breathing them, account of there's so many. It's like their fairness has gone into their color and all their energy into giving me a second task. I've told a bit about what Matt and Pat look like, so I guess I should tell the same about me. Can't see anyone wanting to hear that, any more than they'd want to hear me sing. Not that I sing bad, but somehow everything I try to sing wanders back into Matt's lullaby. Ah, la-dee-die, la-dee-do, oh day. So I try not to sing except when I'm by myself. I end up singing to myself anyways and messing up the others when I try to sing with them. Actually, one kind of elsewhere thing about me is the color of my eyes. They're gold. I don't mean light brown or hazel or goldy blue or goldy green, nor even amber like Con's, which is strange enough. Mine really are gold, pure and simple, like the sun on the water or the center of a daisy. I don't know whether that's a fair thing or no. There's no two judgments when it comes to my hair. The color, well, FONDEST put it best a couple of years back. She was dabbling in the wet ground on the star bank. She loves anything wet. And she suddenly looked closer at the shore water and then up at me and said with a big smile, "Specially, your hair is the color of muddy water." Of course she didn't mean that as a poison stink remark. She was too young. But I think I must have made a bit of a mouth or got briny-eyed or something. She cripped right away that I hadn't liked to hear it. She frowned, maybe at herself, but I think in protest at my reaction, and stamped her little foot and exclaimed, "I like muddy water." The color's the least of my hair's miseries, though. Mud's not pretty, but I guess it's necessary for it to be whithever it is. But the way my hair grows, it's like the mornin' dews. Every human I've ever seen or heard of has hair that's straight or wavy or curly or flat or fluffy or short or long or midways. My hair is different lengths and textures and straightness or waviness or lie downish or stick straight uppish all over my head. Hard to crip, isn't it? I've never been able to, and neither has anyone else, and they try not to laugh at it, but it must be a sore trial to refrain. And I swear, Matt says she doesn't think this can be, but when she stops to think, she's not so sure. The same parts aren't long or short or flat or up or straight or curly 2 days running. Every mornin'-wise, when I get up, first time I look at my reflection in something shiny or wet, my hair is like a whole other head than it was the night afore. Now I have a comb fashed for me by Pat, like the rest of the fam does, but that comb and my hair don't get along very friendly. Hard to get through the hair at all, and by the time I do, the hair is wild enough already for me to start all over again. Once, a few years agone, when I was clipping or hacking away at the unruly mornin' dews, I got the idea I could do the same thing with my hair. I knew in my heart when I thought of this that to really tame it, I'd have to take all of it off and keep taking it off forever. I didn't think that would look very fair, but it wasn't fair the way it was either, and it seemed to me like it would be a lot easier. I took the clippers and put them to a bit of my hair. Then I thought, Matt might not like it if I did something so bold without asking. So I went to her and asked. She looked at me without her usual smile, and I thought for a minute she might be going to brine, and for a long time she didn't say anything. Then finally she said, "I don't think you should, but if it's what you really want specially, I'll give you my benet. First, though, you need to tell your Pat what you've told me and get his." Now, Pat's easy enough to talk about most things, but this didn't seem like the kind of thing I should bother him with. And when it came to it, I felt more than a little silly. But I went to him bravely and told him what I'd told Matt. He'd been playing his flute near the fire, and as I spoke he put it down and looked at me as though he'd really only fully seen me, hair and all, for the first time. When I'd done, he asked me to sit on his lap. Once I got thith, I felt so comforted I hardly memorialed what I'd come to him for. He took my face between his hands and looked at me with such perfect pat-love that I thought my heart would break, and maybe that his had. And he didn't say yes nor no, but said instead, "Specially, I've never said it to you, but you are more special to me than any except Matt herself. There's a whole wonderful world under her hair, and there's one under yours, too." Then he kissed me on the head in one place with my hair was particularly crazy, and said, "I think it's time you were aloft by now." I went aloft, and I slept the best I ever had, though the elder 3 Sibs weren't thith yet, and I've never thought of clipping my hair since. 5th Scribble. Charter. Only half one of us, but the best. Charter is the eldest of us Sibs, birthed 7 years afore me, which makes him 19. His particular bespringing thing is heather, like what grew around the flood-watcher's moor cottage with he and Matt were saved from something pride-child. Not much of it grows in Blue Flower, but we do have a little, and Charter wears it next his heart every day. What does he smell like? Seems he takes on the smell of whatever he's loving at the moment, which isn't only one thing at a time. Seems like it's everything at once. Charter loves so much that you feel his arms around you whenever you're near him, and even when you're not. I've never seen him take a real dislike to anything, nor even seen him truly angry. It's as though his heart was too big for that. I can't imagine how anyone could not love Charter back. But when he goes across the Twin Rivers to trade along of Pat, account of his task is to be next in line to Pat as head of the fam, so he goes with Pat goes and does what Pat does. And to him the duty of that and love seem to be the same thing. The young womenfolk all follow him with their eyes, and maybe the young menfolk where they are don't love that too much. Charter doesn't have a particular woman yet as far as I can crip, and if he ever does I hope she's prepared to come to Blue Flower and live with our fam. He's to be the Pat of Blue Flower when our Pat's gone elsewhere, and he wouldn't think of not doing that task any more than he would think of ruinating anything for the sheer spite of it. There are, I hear, pride-childs who have done just that. He who begot Charter was one of them. Charter has Pat's black hair and brown eyes, and he is the most magnific-looking man for his age I can imagine. But then, of course, I haven't seen many. Apparently the women who follow him with their eyes think the same thing. But the point is, Pat didn't beget Charter, and Charter wasn't begotten in love. Not Mat's love, anyway, or not with her willing, and I can't crip that it could have been out of the love of him who did the begetting either. I've known for a long while how children come into being, and I've known most of my life that Charter is only half part of our fam, blood-wise. But I still can't crip how any man could make any woman with child against her will. It plagues me, especially as it happened to my own Mat, and it just isn't fair in any sense of the word. We don't tell many tales about monsters in our fam, but the monster I know best and want to tear to pieces, like Charter himself would never do, is Charter's begetter. Mat doesn't like the way I feel about that, and when it comes into my mind, as it does at times, it's so ugly, she steers me to thinking of something else. Even now my fingers are a-clenching. You're right, Match. I'm supposed to be scribbling about Charter. Since I can memorial anything, which isn't much afore I was weaned, I memorial Charter taking every one of us Sibs on his knee every night afore going aloft, just like Pat has always done. Sometimes he talks to us, and sometimes not, but what we've always known is that he is with us, and he always will be till he or one of the others of us goes elsewhere, and maybe even after that. Charter's elsewhere story, like Fathom's and Con's, happened when he and Mat and Pat and me were fleeing from whatever pride-child thing happened near Prester's tower. Charter memorials it better than the other Sibs. He was 7 and the others 5 and 3 and myself near 0. But it's as though it's all been swallowed up by his everything love, account of that was the only way he could keep on being brave. He vaguely memorials living with Pat's GRANDFAM till he was about 4, then for some fear following the fam, moving to a cave in the eastern wood. I think Charter memorials me being birthed and Prester dying, but he'll say nothing about it except that he loves the both of us and he's glad that he was thith. So our fam was fleeing, slowly account of me being new and the Sibs being small. But no matter how pride-child a thing they were fleeing from, they had to rest at whiles. First time Charter memorials resting is after they'd forded the first of the southern rivers that runs west from the rest of the flood. It was night, the one after Prester and me were birthed, and the fam rested in the crook of the 2 arms of the flood and that first southern river. Now Pat wanted to keep a watch all through the night, but he needed his sleep, same as we all do, and Charter said that he'd like to watch for a while. Pat, in his wiseness, knew that Charter needed to watch as much as himself needed to sleep, so he told Charter to watch as long as he was able, and then to wake Pat and sleep again along of the rest of the fam. The bell ringer was in the sky then. Charter knew which star of it he was named after, and he's always sure that anything portentous that happens to him is account of that star. But as he watched and watched, east over the flood, south to whither they were going, trying to look north but feeling afraid, at last he happened to look west. Some ways off, but still just inside of the fam, something was slowly turning, and since it shone he could see it in spite of the dark. Part of him thought, no, I can't go that far, but the other part knew he had to learn what it was, account of he was watching for the fam in Pat's stead. He walked nearer and nearer to whatever it was, almost like he was in a dream, but one of those true-seeming ones that come when it's near mornin'-wise. At last he saw something like a fence, round in shape, not too tall, and without a gate. He could have clambered over it, but a non-climbing critter would have been penned by it pretty well. And inside the fence, amid the nighttime grassy places, was a shining critter. I've asked him over and over what kind of a critter, and he says it was none of them or all of them. So I say, no critter in particular then? And Charter says, no, all of them in particular. Only a few faces of this everything critter became plain to him as it turned. He cripped it had many faces he wasn't seeing. He thinks that every sort of critter that is was thith somewith, but the only faces he could see clearly were those of 5 bewinged things, a great blue heron, a gyrfalcon, a golden eagle, a stormy petrel, and a boreal owl. Charter was afraid to speak to it, or them, but he was more afraid not to, and he didn't rightly know what to say. Then finally he thought he'd ask, "Please, who's made you a prisoner? Tell me and I'll make them let you go." The critter slowed down a bit, and Charter thought did something like laugh. It answered, "Do you see anything without wings? I can fly out whenever I choose." "Why don't you then?" Charter wondered, though he didn't say it. That's what he and the rest of the fam were doing, if not on wings. It answered, "The fence is not to keep me in, but to keep others out, till such a time as they come that I'm waiting for. Right now I'm waiting for one in particular, name of Charter." This scared Charter more than anything that had happened yet, but not in a bad way if there's any doxology in that. Bit of a dark saying to me still. But he had to confess to the critter, "I'm Charter." The critter slowed almost to a stop, but Charter still saw those 5 bewinged faces running into one another. "You've got a task to do, Charter," they all said. Charter answered, "I know. My task is to help my Pat watch." And they answered back, "Since you've taken it upon yourself to do that, we've taken it on ourselves to reward you with some help." The critter told him that he needed to choose one particular bewinged thing of the 5 for each of the fam, including himself. Charter got even more afraid. Account of this surely ought to be Pat's decision, or Matt's. He couldn't crip how he could possibly choose right. But also he thought and said, "There's only 5 of you. What about specially? And what about Prester?" "Prester's well watched after. Don't fear for him. As for specially, it might not seem fair to you or her, but she'll have to wait another while." Charter doesn't memorial how long it took him turning those 5 faces around in his heart, till he could settle on any one for anyone. Finally he said, "Can I choose mine first? Not to choose the best, but just to get it done?" And the face that looked at him right then was the golden eagle's. "From this night I am your particular bewinged thing," said the eagle, "and I will never leave you." Then Charter went on, he doesn't crip how, to choose the boreal owl for CONIFER, and the gyrfalcon for Matt, and the great blue heron for Pat, and the stormy petrel for FATHOM. And next he knew the golden eagle was hovering over his shoulder, and the other 4 flying HITH and THITH, in anticipation to get WHITH. It was their task to go. And he couldn't see the fence any more, and he wondered whether it had ever been THITH. But all the 5 bewinged things kept the same shining that the everything critter had had, and they all followed Charter. The eagle perched on him now, back to the fam. He didn't wake Pat up, account of he knew there were others to help watch, and he himself slept. And come morning-wise, each of the fam, except MISERYME, had their own particular bewinged thing that would never leave. But I've got you, Match, finally, and you won't leave either. And whether he crips so or not, I think Charter had something to do with that, account of since I was birthed, he's been looking out for wings for me.
6th Scribble. Fathom, eyes you can't get to the bottom of, nor neither the top. It comes into my morning dewy mind that when I was scribbling about Pat, I never said what his particular bespringing thing is. It's the white water lilies that grow in our western twin river. That would be the star. I seem to memorial telling how there were white lilies growing at the fording place of the flood with Pat was watcher. They were in a water west of him then, and so they are now. Our east twin, the stone, has lilies of every other color that lilies grow, but no white ones, and the star has no lilies of any color but white. Pat doesn't wear the white lilies, but he puts them in bowls in the places with Matt spends most of her time inside and out, and puts them at the head and foot of the bed he fashed and shares with Matt. It was over the lilies at the flood ford that Matt came to him. I'm scribbling about Fathom now, though, and I guess that thing I overlooked about Pat crept in account of Fathom doesn't wear his particular bespringing thing either. Nor do I, come to think of it. As if the morning dews weren't enough of a nuisance being planted in the ground, and as if my morning dewy hair wasn't enough of a nuisance. Match, did you just nip me? I almost think you did. Anyway, Fathom's particular bespringing thing. Are you happy now, you little lizard who just happens to have wings? Sorry, I just rolled a mean stone, and I'm sure it'll roll back on me. Is the lady hair grasses, as we call them, that grow near which the twins run into the southern sea, same as those that grew between Matt's GRANDFAM and the sea to the west of them. Fathom's hair is what they call yellow, but it's the color of the ends of those grasses, like grain out of which you'd fash bread. And his eyes are green, deep green, like what I'd imagine the bottom of a clear ocean is, and his wearing cloth color is the same as his eyes, just as Charter's cloth color is the same as Charter's eyes, like rich brown earth. If you believe Fathom's Elsewhere story, which I do in the veriest way, he was at the bottom of the sea once. Aside from wondering how he could breathe, which he couldn't crip himself, I've always wondered if he wasn't scared of being so deep in the dark. He smiles at me and says, "It wasn't dark. That's what those as haven't been thith can't see." Fathom sees everything even when he can't see it. What I mean is, he knows about things without seeing them with those green eyes, just as though his eyes had seen them. I think when he looks at his particular bespringing thing, he really does see lady hair, the Tower ladies, or a sea ladies, or the hair of the twin queens that Matt once met above. I don't know what he sees when he looks out to sea, but I crip it makes him want to go thith. Many's the time one of the younger Sibs will wander away from me, or even a time when I can't find Pat in any of his regular places. You can't never not find Matt. And all I have to do, if Fathom is about, is to ask what the others are, and he already knows. Kind of he always seems to know, seems like he's never afraid. There was a thing near the beginning of his Elsewhere story that did scare him, but he trusted Stormy Petrel, and I don't think he's been much afraid since. I've said he sometimes goes to trade with Pat and Charter, but I think that's mainly because he wants to go deeper to understanding things than he can by always biting in blue flower. Fathom loves everything deep. He loves tending the bespringing things that have deep roots, and he loves digging anywhat that needs dug, and he likes wandering into the Sancti Mount cave through which the flood flows, and chipping a bit of promising rock he finds and uncovering the beauty inside of it. But as Fathom says, the sea is the deepest place, and that's with he spends as much daytime as isn't taken with his other tasks. He does some tasks even thith, among the eatables like sorrel and spinach and strawberries that grow in sandy soil. He gathers shells, cockle shells and limpets and cowries and abalones and murexes and whelks, as well as picking up fair stones washed smooth by the waves, and he brings them to the habitat to make the borders of our garden plots and our paths. And he knows all the shorewise bespringing things, goldenrods and beach plums, lupins and verbena and sea oats. He knows all the seabirds like egrets and cormorants and storks, and he knows all the critters that live at the border of blue flower and the sea. The crabs, he says they follow him like he was their pat, and the starfish and those that can't move except with the waves, like the sea urchins and anemones. I guess there's no need to tell that Fathom smells like the sea. It's when Fathom's at the seaside that Stormy Petrel flies out a ways to skim the surface waters for fish, almost like it was walking on the water. Petrel would bring some fish back to Fathom if Fathom wanted them, but Fathom says they should stay in their own place, and if he was in their place, he'd probably be swimming among them and whatever else is down thith without thinking much about eating. It's Stormy Petrel that brought about Fathom's Elsewhere story, same as it's Boreal Owl that brought about Con's. Stormy Petrel came to Fathom when Charter led the particular bewinged things to the fam. But Fathom, who was 2 years less than Charter, that would be 5 at the time, didn't see it till he woke with the next sun. And he knew somehow Petrel, like Pat's great blue heron, was a seabird, and from that time the whole fam thinks the green of Fathom's eyes got even deeper. Fathom's Elsewhere story, like Charter's, happened at night while the rest of the fam slept. The fam had just forded the second of the southwest rivers, and they were resting between the crook of that and the flood. As I've said, they didn't crip what they were going except floodwise, and that seemed to bother Fathom more than the others, young as he was. He'd wake up o' nights when everyone else was sleeping, trying to see, as if he could, what that flood finally led to. Anyway, while the others slept, Fathom was awake, staring down the flood. Occasionally he'd look up at the Fathom star that he was named after, but looking up has always made him a bit dizzy. And Stormy Petrel, that was perched on his shoulder, suddenly took its head out from under its wing and said, "Do you trust me, Fathom?" Fathom hadn't known till then that Stormy Petrel could talk, But he wasn't especially surprised. He thinks maybe it had been talking to him ever since it came to him, only he hadn't been able to hear him account of the voices or the other members of the fam, and their bewinged things and the noise of the flood. The flood was quieter that night than usual, and he heard Petrel's voice quite plain asking him if he trusted it. Fathom said he expected he did, but he couldn't help but furrow his brow a bit and ask, "Why?" It answered, "I have something to show you. But you need to see it from above first, and you're not bewinged, so you'll have to ride on my back." Now Fathom was young, but he could plainly see that he was bigger than the petrel, so riding on its back wasn't doxology. But he forgot about that with thinking about having to go up high. As I've said, Fathom is a deep person, but not a high one like Con. He memorials living for a bit with Pat's GRANDFAM and being afraid of the mountains to the north. He saw with more than eyesight that there was something pride-child-thith. When Fathom was 2 and not yet weaned and our fam moved to the cave in the eastern wood, he felt relieved to be away in a deep place with a roof and plenty of trees around it that hid the mountains from view. And the little he memorials of Prester's tower, he didn't want to look up at that either, account of even though it wasn't that high, it felt higher than the stars themselves. He kept his eyes on the light of the Sancti fount not far off, and I think that vision has never left him. So Fathom didn't rightly want to trust Petrel to take him above, but it was his particular bewinged thing, and he saw that if he didn't trust it now, the next time it asked would be harder, and then harder, and maybe after a while he wouldn't be able to trust it at all. And if that happened, it would be a fire of his own kindling. So he did the 14 like Matt had taught him, and said in his high boy voice, as not shakily as he could, "I trust you." When he'd said that, it seemed that the petrel got bigger, or he got smaller, or maybe both at once, and now he saw that he really might ride on its back. He did another rushed few breaths, not at all at the proper pace of the 14, and climbed astride it. It rose into the air, but not too high, just hovering above the flood at first, then starting to go forward. Except it wasn't going forward. It was going back, along the flood, to the north. Fathom felt safe so low down and close to the flood, but he didn't want to go that direction from which he'd been fleeing, towards those northward mountains. Still, he knew it would be poison stink, or even a pride-child thing to not trust Petrel when he'd said he would. So he did, but he kept his eyes on the flood, and not ahead, and especially not up. Petrel took him all the way to the base of the biggest mountain from which the flood fell, and it asked him again, "Do you trust me, Fathom?" He shook his head that he did, but his eyes were tight shut, because he saw before there was anything to see that the petrel was going to take him up now. Fathom never knew how high it took him. He says that, like Blue Flower's Tree, the flood mountain doesn't have any top that anyone can see, even if they are looking. But he felt the wind getting thinner and thinner, and his insides dropping lower and lower until at last they'd got to whatever top they were going to. The petrel turned back southward, still hovering. Fathom could feel this, though he sure wasn't looking to check. And a third time Petrel says to him, "Do you trust me, Fathom?" Up thith, with they were, Fathom's voice wouldn't have made any sound if he'd answered, but he gripped Petrel with his knees and hugged it tighter with his arms as if to say yes. Fathom says that was the hardest thing he's ever done. He thinks if he hadn't done it, he wouldn't be able to see things without seeing them as he does now. He didn't try to look up, nor even out, account of he and Petrel were so high, but he looked down and could just glimpse the flood way below him, no bigger than the last trickle at the end of a rain. "Hold on a bit tighter if you like," said Petrel. "You can't hurt me, but make sure you keep holding, and keep your eyes open, but don't look straight down, account of it might make you dizzy. Keep your eyes on the flood running south, which is where we're going." Petrel dove. Fathom kept his eyes on the flood. He couldn't have stood it else. He couldn't let himself think about the 14 or how far up they were, but he looked only to the flood, and he says it was lighted up like the Sancti fount had been near Prester's tower. The flood got bigger and bigger, which meant nearer and nearer, and Fathom felt like he was on the back of the falling flood itself. Then Petrel pulled up, and they were skimming the surface of the flood, straight away south. They passed Prester's tower, and the first of the southwest rivers with Petrel had come to him, then the second with Petrel had first spoken to him, and the rest of the fam still slept, and they passed a third southwest river, and he doesn't know how many more after that. But it didn't matter, account of at last he knew whither he was meant to be going. Finally the flood ran right through a small mountain, our Sancti Mount, as he now knows, and came out the other side. And then the petrel danced like, back and forth, and sideways, and with a kind of exhilaration that Fathom felt too. He couldn't see too much below, account of it was night, but by the light of the bell ringer, and Fathom didn't feel afraid to look up at the ringer now. He saw a valley between two rivers that had been birthed by the flood, or that the flood had become, and everything he could see below him was deep blue, as though the sky itself had come down to the ground. "This is your habitat, and the habitat of your fam," said Petrel. "Just keep following the flood, and I'll memorial you if you need it. And as I expect you're still trusting me, we'll go on a bit further." The next thing Fathom knew, they were skimming the tops of the ladyhair grass, and after that the tops of the waves. Fathom has his eyes wide open now, and after daring to look up, he dared to look down to the deepest place he had ever seen. It was the sea, and it seemed dark to his eyes, but he guessed now that it only looked that way. And soon he knew it. Account of the petrel not only flew him farther south than he could grip, but down under. Birds can't go under water more than a short time, but petrel did. And it and Fathom, who oughtn't to have been able to either, went deeper and deeper, and Fathom felt he could have kept going deeper forever, and that was his task. He says he doesn't think the sea has a bottom, not really, any more than the flood mountain and the side-tree have a top. He says he can't tell what he saw when they finally stopped going down, though he dreams of it often and memorials more and more, but says it's not his task to tell this part to anyone else. There were colors and shapes all shining, and there were critters, some almost seeming human, and there were habitats of critters, and below that there was, he says, the same patterns of lights as the stars. He memorials touching the very heart of the down-under Fathom star as he passed. He thinks he must have slept then. Account of the next he memorials, he was not only above the water again, but speeding back up northward along the flood, and afore he could properly get the morning dew out of his eyes, it was morning-wise, and he was in the crook of the flood and of the second southwest river. The fam were all walking, and Petrel, shrunk to its proper size, was tucking its head back under its wing. The fam never crept why Fathom was wanting sleep when the rest of them were done with it, and he couldn't properly have told them even if he'd had a bigger vocab. But when they were ready to journey again, it didn't feel like fleeing now, and Pat picked him up to carry him so he could still sleep with Petrel on his shoulder, Fathom opened his eyes so wide it looked like they'd never shut again. "I know where the fam needs to go," he said. "I've been thith. Go straight and thithwise, and keep your eyes on the flood." And account of I've already scribbled it, even a blind critter could see with that let us. Even with I'm scribbling now, and now I think my eyes'll shut for a while. CONIFER comes next. Seventh Scribble. CONIFER, my closest, and without whom I can't imagine. I feel shy scribbling about Con. It's as if I'm afraid if I write about him, he'll disappear. And if that was to happen... He's the only one of my Sibs I call by short for his name. I learned to say Con afore I could say the rest, and I keep coming back to that somehow. Before I could say fire, I said fur, and no wonder. Con's eyes are amber, as I've already scribbled, and his wearing cloth color is gold, and his hair is red like Matt's, only not quite so deep. It grows upward, straight as a flame, so I'm not the only Sib with strange hair, though mine's even stranger. He smells like the smoke from the sweet-burning woods there are, even some we don't have in blue flower. His particular bespringing thing is something no one knew of till we came HITH, so Con gave it a name himself, Dog Star. It blooms at night, and Con's about a lot then. Every night he'll pluck one bloom of it and hold it in his hand for a while, and then breathe on it. And he says that when he's done that, it goes right up to the star group in the sky he calls Big Dog. I've been with him once or twice when he's done it, and though I can't say I've seen it go up that far, I've seen it go up till I couldn't see it any more. Con helps Pat at the forge, and he does all the fire lighting and putting out, and buries the ashes like Pat's people used to do in a spot only he knows. He says you've got to give back some of what you've taken in order to get any more. Con can start a fire, it seems, almost by staring at it with those amber eyes. Since Match came to me, Con sometimes borrows him and lets Match do it. But I think that's more to be part of Match and me than account if he needs help. Con's other task is reading the stars, like Matt's people used to do, and even more so. He reads them as well as a tower lady, it seems. He tells the whole fam things he sees up thith, but he tells me the most. I think account if he knows I care the most. When I'm allowed to be up at night, we lie near the base of the Sancti Mount and look up at the side-tree, and Con points out all the stars of the bell ringer and the Seven Sibs, including his own star, and Big Dog, and Big Bear, and what he calls Big Match, and a lot of the same ones Matt saw when she was up there from Prester's tower, except I think Con sees some Matt never even did. He says everything that happens in Blue Flower can be traced up thith, and he can even see some things outside of Blue Flower, with he hardly memorials being outside. He says the verse is all over the place above. He says Prester's tower is only the end of the part of the verse we know, and so I should try to think beyond Prester a bit more. But he understands how lonely I am, account of Prester more than anyone else does, and he's tried his best to take Prester's place. I think he wouldn't spend nearly so much time with me if it weren't for that. It's almost as if Presterless me was one of his tasks. He listens to everything I say and tries to lead me, and sometimes he lets me do a little leading, just to make me feel like I know something more than he. Sometimes, though, I'll say things to him that he listens to, but turns right aside, as though he knows that they're not for his hearing. When I got interested in learning letters, I begged Con over and over to learn them with me. Kind of I didn't want to be the only among the Sibs that knew that, nor the only that could read my own scribbling either. Con would only shake his head friendly-like and say, "Scribbling things that aren't thith yet's your task specially. Reading what's already thith is mine." Letters are strong, but stars, except they hold themselves back, would burn all the letters to ashes. Kind of makes me feel the stars aren't always so comfortable to be around, but Con is, and if he's all right with them, then I am. Another thing about Con, he knows when he can't get my head out of a muddy, morning-dewy place any other way, to sing Matt's lullaby to me, and sometimes even with me. It works when nothing else will. I don't know how Con knows to do that, but I expect it has something to do with his Elsewhere story. Matt weaned Con a little quicker than usual, right afore Prester and I were birthed, account of she knew she was having two, and she knew it would be hard to feed three at once. This happened right afore the fam left the cave in the wood and fled to Prester's tower, and after the birthing fled again south. By then, when the fam was resting between the crook of the third southwest river and the flood, and Charter had picked our bewinged things, and Fathom had cripped with we were going, Con had started to get used to having to share Matt with me, but he didn't exactly understand about me, and he understood even less about Prester, though if he had understood he'd have known that Matt kept him by her side at night, as she would not have done so close if Prester hadn't gone elsewhere, and he wouldn't have got to hear her lullaby so close either. So the fam was resting, me lying in the crook of Matt's right arm, and Con in her left, with Pat asleep on Con's other side. Con had wakened and was feeling a bit squirmy, account of everything had changed so much all of a sudden, and he felt like he could sleep better if it was as it used to be a few days afore. He had his face buried in Matt's shoulder, but he couldn't get settled, so he decided to turn over on his back. And who should be, not just perched at his head, but looking right down at him, but Boreal Owl. Con knew the owl was his somehow, or he was its. He couldn't say Boreal Owl yet, but called it Browl. So Browl was looking down at him with eyes that seemed bigger than the moon. In fact, the owl itself seemed way bigger than afore Con had dozed off that night. Now everyone knows that owls of whatever sort always sound like they're asking one question, which is, who? Till then, Con hadn't quite cripped what who meant, but now it seemed to him he did. He smiled and answered, CONIFER, which is as close as he could get to saying his own name as yet. Browl looked at him with even bigger eyes, big as the sun maybe, and Con thought it was going to say who again, and he was looking forward to answering CONIFER again. But Browl said no such thing. Rather, it sang a bit of Matt's lullaby. Ah, lottie-die, lottie-do, oh day. At 3, Con wasn't too likely to be surprised, since he wasn't even sure what he was supposed to be like, much less what anyone else was. They were all just thith, like he was just thith. Con didn't know about the 14 yet, but he felt he needed to wait and not say anything in too much of a hurry. Ah, lottie-die, lottie-do, oh day, crooned Browl again. Con doesn't memorial this about himself, but I know Con, and I know he must have grinned so big that his mouth must have hurt, and his eyes were probably about as big as the owl's. He knew then that even if he couldn't keep hearing Matt's lullaby from her, Boreal Owl would keep singing it to him. Blissful as could be, he held out his arms to the bird and squealed, "Go!" Next thing he knew, he was clinging to Browl's underside with his face in its breast feathers, and they were already up in the air and flying south. Con didn't know what south was, but from what followed, he's come to know that that's the way they went. After a bit, it seems Browl wanted to rest, so it perched, not at the top account of there isn't any, but way up high in the side-tree. Con didn't know the side-tree then, but as soon as the fam got to Blue Flower, he recognized it at once. He felt like if Browl could rest in the arms of the tree, he could too. So he let loose of Browl and watched it preen its feathers while himself was held as secure in the arms of the side-tree as he had ever felt in Matt's. But being 3, pretty soon Con started to get squirmy again,
So again he held out his arms to Browl and said, "Go!" Go was too small a word for whith they went next. They went straight up to the sancty places, whith Matt had been, and Con was introduced by Browl to the bell ringer, and then to the bell ringer's big dog, who let Con sit on his back. And the bell ringer talked to Browl for what seemed to Con like forever, and Con couldn't understand much, but he did hear Browl say, "Who?" and the ringer answer, "Big Bear," and Browl said, "Who?" again, and the ringer answered, "Big Match." Then Browl turned to Con and asked, "Ah, lottie-do?" And Con grinned again, and off ran Big Dog with Con on his back, and Boreal Owl speeding before them. They passed all sorts of critters and things, and even sancty people that Con didn't have a name for, though I expect he does now. Finally they got to whith Big Bear and Big Match were, and it seems they were already waiting for the bell ringer's message. Browl was supposed to deliver it, but Con got so excited he couldn't wait, and even though he didn't know exactly what the message was, he said very solemn this time, "Go!" Then Browl repeated something like that, only longer in his own hooing speech. Owl said, "Hoo!" and Big Bear got up on his hind feet and did a little dance. Owl said, "Hoo!" and Big Match, who was like my Match, only bigger and with wings like hide rather than see-through, and who was what is called a dragon, except we don't know for sure whether there are any width but above. Big Match chased his own tail for a bit and nearly set it on fire. And then off they all went, Big Bear lumbering, Big Dog galloping, and Big Match shooting straight ahead like a flying furnace. They went all the way north to the mountain where the flood comes down, but when they were still up above, Browl picked up Con by the scruff of his neck, so he was sort of dangling, but now I could see something besides just Browl's breast feathers. Big Dog gave a tail wag worthy of his size, then sped off back to the bell ringer. But Big Match and Big Bear and Browl and Con swooped down to the mountain, what would have been the top of it if there was any, maybe the same spot with Stormy Petrel had taken Fathom, and this is what Con saw. The mountains to the west had side trees, though not as tall as blue flowers, growing on them, and the east had no trees, but somethings of a shape Con didn't recognize and didn't want to, and for a split second he wished he was back with Matt and me. The flood seemed all lit up, as though the stars had fallen closer to earth. Big Bear gave what might have been a big growl, but it sounded more like, "Ah, law," and took a big leap toward whatever Con didn't like that was on the eastern mountains, and Con didn't know what Big Bear did after that. Big Match hovered there for a bit, but his breath got hotter and hotter. Browl apparently thought better of so much nearness to a fire about to start, and he flew Con off and hovered over Prester's tower, which was a safe enough distance away. Con looked down at the sort of fallen starlight and saw the sancty fount light rushing up in the midst of all, but he couldn't keep his eyes off Big Match for long. Then it sounded to him like Big Match said, "Day." Big Match spread his wings as though he was going to hug everything below, but it seemed he wasn't in a hugging mood. All around him, in the shape of himself, there appeared what looked like swords made of lightning, and Big Match caught one and hurled it down along with a mighty blast of his breath. Then everything Con could see was fire and lightning, and he only figured out later that it was Prester's tower that they were over by the sound of a bell ringing louder and louder, till he had to stick his fingers in his ears. Then the fire and lightning got so bright that he had to shut his eyes. But whatever he did, he couldn't shut out the bell wailing fit to burst apart. Before it could ring so hard as that, Browl flew him south back along the flood till they got to whith the fam was sleeping, and Browl put him right back in Matt's left arm. Browl preened his feathers a bit, then winked at Con and said, "Dee-di-dee-do-o," and Con fell asleep against Matt's chest. When Con first told me this story, long aforetime and agone, I kept asking whether Big Dog didn't come down too. Big Dog seems a bit more comfortable to me than Big Bear and Big Match, and even than the bell ringer, since the ringer seems to have sent the other two down to make some necessary poison stink or other, maybe even to ruinate some things. Con said, Big Dog might have come down, or he might not, and he might still. Any of them might. It's our task to wait and be ready if they do. He also said, the bell ringer doesn't ruinate anything, not really. Someday you'll crip. After scribbling Con's Elsewhere story, I was meaning to go right on to Prester, but I need to scribble one more thing that happened between me and Con just last night. We were looking up at the stars together, not lying down this time, but walking about Blue Flower near the habitat. Boreal Owl and Match were with us as usual, and Con was holding my hand, not out of love, but I felt a bit unsteady on my feet lately, which is why I'm mostly scribbling now and not doing all the tasks I used to do. Except for Matt and Pat, no one else in the fam seems to want to mention it. I think Matt and Pat have told them that's the way it is, and they just accept it at that, though sometimes I feel them looking at me when they think I'm not looking, same as I've always thought they ought to look at my hair. So last night, Con suddenly stops us walking and took my other hand also in his, and looked at me direct as can be, and said, "You haven't been feeling too well lately, have you, specially?" I don't know why, but somehow to have him say that so solemn made me start brining. So he took me in his arms and said, "I knew your head hurts sometimes, and sometimes you're dizzy, and sometimes your eyes blur a bit. I don't need Matt or Pat or you to tell me that, for the stars have told me, especially Prester's star. I can't see what'll come of it, but I do see the bell ringer's going to do something, and whatever it is, it's going to be your task to scribble it, and none of the fam are going to be able to help you with that more than a little. Match'll help, I know, but the one you'll really need to help is Prester. For once you're right about that. Now let's get ourselves aloft." And so we headed back to the habitat. But just before we went in, Con pointed up to one of the Seven Sibs. "I met your twin when I was up Fifth," he said. I held Prester's hand, and Prester said to me, "Be sure to hold tight to Specially's hand till I can do it myself." 8th Scribble. Prester, and why I'm half hopeless. This whole scribble is more about Prester than anything, and now it comes to what I've most wanted to scribble about, I find that I don't want to. For one thing, no scribbling can tell proper about me and Prester. For another, I can't feel him reading over my shoulder right now. Seems like the more I've scribbled on his account, the less I feel him with me, and I can't crip that. I'm not saying he isn't Thith, but I don't have the sense of it that I once did. And that makes the scribbling harder, like trying to lay your hand on a bit of moonbeam. You see it, but if you try to hold it, it's as if it wasn't Thith at all. Con may think Prester would have looked like me, but I don't believe it. I think my hair is muddy account of Prester ran off with all its color, and my hair is crazy account of it keeps reaching out for him elsewhere. I've known about Prester since I was weaned, but I think my body would have known something was missing, even if my brain hadn't. All my life I've felt like I was hopping around on one leg, having had the other chopped off, but having to make do. Every time there's a poison snake in my head, or my heart, or among my sibs, or the morning dews, I feel like it's that way because Prester isn't HITH. And I've always known I could never be a Matt with a Pat, I could never feel about any other man the way I do about the man who would have been Prester. Con thinks I've always thought too much about Prester, but I haven't known how to help it. If Prester had been HITH, I think I could have helped it, but if he had been HITH, then I wouldn't have needed to. Prester needs more than a scribble, he needs a verse. The verse is already about Prester, but if I was to fash it, every line would be the same. There'll be a Prester, there'll be a Prester, and then only, a Prester. Like the lullaby tune that won't let me sing any other. I can't match. I can't fash a verse about Prester. You know I can't better than I do. Prester knows it too. Don't tell me I don't know what Prester knows. But of course I don't quite, and that's the problem, isn't it? Do it anyway. Who said that? Match? You were passing it on? Who passed it to you? I can't crip that, Match. Prester wouldn't pass it to you and not to me first. He wouldn't, account of I'm the closest thing still HITH to himself. Is that why I can't feel him so well? Account of I can't tell us apart any more? Do it anyway. I've told you I can't, and I'd tell Prester too if he was HITH. But I can see neither of you nor the bell ringer himself are going to let me get on with this scribbling unless I do. And I'm only half done so far with what I already know, and I can't learn any more till that much is scribbled. I knew from the beginning that I would ruinate this, and now you're asking me to ruinate it some more? Have it your own way then, since I plainly can't have it mine, since there's nothing special about specially. Can you fly me, Match, over mountain, over sea, however far, to my heart's nesting place? My arms are open, to take Prester into them, to take back my flesh and blood. I can't scribble like the fasher of the verse. I can't light fires like Con, nor trample grapes like CARRYWISH. But I've watched and I've waited since aforetime and agone, vanity as it is, and now it's in the bell ringer's hands. We were together in Matt's womb, Prester and me. We were twin-birthed. I know his voice, I know the feel of him, and the smell of him, but our together story went elsewhere as soon as it began. If my love for him was all mornin' dew, but it's not. He's my flesh and blood more than any. Don't let go of me, Prester. I've got a task still, and I'm running out of awakeness, and I can't see clearly. But I need to trust like Fathom trusted stormy petrel. I can't crip how what should be can be, but the bell ringer does, and I expect you do. Prester is my crown of 1,000 sorrows that I've tried to be valiant in wearing, but my eyes are dried up with brining, and my head is up somewhat near the specially star. I want to go to Prester's tower, but it's too distant. I want it to be night thith, listening to Matt's lullaby, with the bell ringer above, and Prester's hand in mine. I want to rest. But more than that, I want it to be mornin'-wise, and Prester still with me, not gone with my dreaming. I want it to be mornin'-wise, with the blue flowers mornin' dews about me, and my hand in Prester's hand. I want it to be mornin'-wise.
Ninth Scribble. Penny-dance only dances while she brines, and MISERYME makes her. I dread this scribble. I want to be fair to Penny-dance. Penny-dance is the fairest of us, but I swear I've spent the last 7 years helping raise her and doing the 14 from mornin'-wise to aloft time, or making her do it. The worst of it is, I know she especially loves me, and I want to feel the same. I do love her, or I would never put up with her. I'd crawl to Matt and Pat on my knees and say, "Take this one back under your own care, account of I seem to be failing." It's more what she says than what she does or doesn't do, though what she does and doesn't do would be a trial in itself. But I said I wanted to be fair, so I'll start by telling how fair she is. Her hair is black like Pat's, and it falls in perfect curls down almost to her ankles, and if I didn't clip it sometimes she'd be tripping all over it. She smells like her hair, like newness and cleanness. Her eyes are green, not deep like Fathom's, but bright like a new leaf lit by sunshine. Her wearing cloth color is purple, and when you see her wear it, you feel it is the best color in the bell ringer's rainbow. Her first task is to learn all Matt's tasks, and she does them pretty well. Her other task is to search for bespringing things that are hard to come by, like mushrooms, and Matt's lavender, and rare herbs that are shy of being seen and needing a bit of coaxing to thrive. That task she does mostly when she's with me, and sometimes she does it so well that I wish that was true to all I do. And other times she doesn't. She doesn't do it at all, or she does it very slowly and repeats Matt's GRANDFAM's saying about slow being better than no. And sometimes she'll do it so wrong that it's like she's trying to ruinate things on purpose. Many's the time I've known her to fill her gathering basket with just what was wanted, suddenly put it down, start skipping around it, then kick it and stomp on all she'd found, or pick it up with her perfect hands and tear it all to pieces and throw them up in the air with a laugh. When I ask her why she did it, she'll say, "'Cause was," or why she's doing it now, she'll say, "'Cause is," and then she'll say, "I'm sorry," but keep doing it anyway. I tell her you can't be sorry if you're still doing it, and she'll say, "Can't I? I'm sorry," and do it some more. I tell her "'cause was and "'cause is aren't reasons, and she shouldn't do anything without a reason account of it doesn't scan, and she'll say, "You sound just like Pat's GRANDFAM." And that makes me so mad I'll make it worse by saying, "You hang on nothing." And she'll say things don't always have to hang on other things, and then she'll roll some really mean stone like, "I'm glad Prester wasn't my twin," and I'll wonder why she would think to say such a thing. But even then I can't tell if it's said in spite, or if she means something different by it than it seems to mean. I shared Matt with her the last year before I was weaned, and I wonder whether there wasn't something in little me that was mad about that and still is. But Penny-dance shared with CARRYWISH for 2 years, and FONDEST and RIGHTFUL shared and were weaned early to make room for Mary-ago, and sharing is a good thing, and so is making room, so that can't be it. Maybe it's the way her special bewinged thing, Mockingbird, imitates everything I say instead of imitating her, or the way it raises its tail as though to approve when she's being especially annoying. Maybe it's this habit she has, mostly when she's amongst her special bespringing things, the half-pink, half-yellow daisies, of turning around and around slowly to no purpose, stopping and picking up a daisy, then starting to turn again slowly the other way, over and over, saying, "Daisy, daisy, daisy," as she goes.
After a while I get dizzy just being around her, and I'll say, "Penny dance, either dance properly or stand still." And she'll say, "I will, if you make your hair mind you." And I'll say, "You know I can't." And she'll say, "Nor can I stand still." And then I'll say something really poisonous stink like, "Why can't you be more like CARRYWISH?" Then she will stop, stand very still, and tears will well up in her eyes, and while she's brining she'll start really dancing, and I feel like the worst misery-me there ever was. And while she's brine dancing, instead of saying "Daisy, Daisy," she'll say, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Worst of all is when she adds something like, "I'd give you my hair if I could, specially. I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Once I asked her, "Penny-dance, do you know why you make such a poison stink for me when you don't for anyone else? Or is it just one of those 'cause-is things?" She answered, "No, it isn't. That one has a 'cause. It's 'cause I'm your task." And that was an answer I couldn't answer back to, account of I knew it was true. And this time I was the one that didn't know why. For a long time I thought Penny-dance was going to be like me and not have an elsewhere story, but what she calls her elsewhere story, so I guess I must. Happened right afore I started all this scribbling. Match had just come to me. Match seemed specially to take to Penny-dance for some reason, and we were out among with the daisies meet the morning dews, and Match and Mockingbird were chattering back and forth to each other. Penny-dance told them to shush, actually sat down in front of me without squirming, like a 3-year-old, looked at me real solemn, and said, "I have an elsewhere story now." I was interested to hear this, but when she started telling it, it was the worst thing I'd heard from her yet. I fess, I thought it was a lie almost from the first, but I didn't say so. Morning-wise yesterday, I was by the mouth of the cave that the twins flow out of, looking for something to put in my basket that no one has ever seen afore. You're not supposed to go that near the Sancti Mount without one of the others of us being with you, Penny-dance. I know, I'm sorry. I'd finished helping Matt, and she sent me off to find you, but I knew there was something I wanted to look for first, and I wanted to surprise you when I'd found it. She paused for a long time, as though she was afraid of telling you any more, but knew she had to. Well, go on, I prompted. Did you find it? I found it, but it wasn't what I thought I was looking for. What was it? It was, Charter says he's sorry. Charter says? Was Charter with you? What has Charter ever done to be sorry for? She shook her head. Not that one. In the cave. But he says he's sorry. Charter was in the cave? I told you not that one. The man that lives in the cave. A man lives in the cave? No one else has ever seen him. This story was getting more muddy every minute. He's prisoned there. You have to go in to be able to see him. A long way in. Further than FATHOM goes. You went into the cave? That was pride, child, Penny-dance. I really should tell Pat and Matt. You could have hurt yourself. I know. I'm sorry. But I heard him brining. Heard who brining? The man in the cave. Charter. I almost lost my temper then, but managing to keep it, I said sternly, Penny-dance, do the 14 right now. Breathe times 2. Breathe times 3. Times 4. Times 5. And now tell me the truth. She looked at me as hurt as I've ever seen her. It was like I'd grabbed hold of Mockingbird and pulled off its wings. I could see she was going to start to brine. You don't believe me, she said, as though she couldn't believe that I wouldn't. Then she stood up and started to dance. But this time she didn't say, I'm sorry. She said, Struth, there's a man prisoned in the cave. Charter. And he's sorry. But he thinks he's not sorry as he should be since he can't get out. He told me to tell you. And he showed me a crack in the floor and said below there are others who ought to be sorry but aren't. And he doesn't know how they'll ever get up to WHITH he is. And he doesn't know if he'll ever get out either, account of he can't forgive himself unless he knows he's forgiven. And he told me to tell you he's sorry. Charter told me. I've never seen Penny-dance dance so fast or brine so hard, and it made it difficult to understand her. And whether or not what she said was true, I knew she believed it was, and this was all my doing. There's been times when she was dancing and brining, and I'd try to calm her, and she'd ask me to dance with her. And I'd tell her she knew very well if I tried I'd step on her feet, and my own besides, and she oughtn't to be so mocking as to think of asking me to. So she'd stop asking and go back to, I'm sorry. This time she didn't ask. This time I wanted her to, but she didn't. And she didn't say she was sorry either. I got up and danced anyways, and a sorry fool I must have looked. And I did step on my feet, and once on hers, and I started brining too. And if it was hard for PENNYDANCE to dance and brine and still talk, it was even harder for me. But I managed to gasp, "I believe you, PENNYDANCE. Charter says he's sorry. But are you sure he told you to tell me that?" She suddenly stopped, and all the brining dried up at once. I stopped dancing, but I couldn't stop brining. She smiled the purest smile possible, and said, "He spoke your name, specially." And still beaming all over her face and starting to giggle now, which made me giggle even though I was still brining, she hugged me so hard it hurt, still hugging me, starting dancing again. Slower now, like all the world had been forgiven of whatever ails it. I couldn't grip then nor since what this story meant, but I knew it was portentous. Account of it was the first time she ever danced except while she brines, and I knew it must be true. There is a man Charter, prison in the cave. He's sorry, and so am I. Tenth Scribble. CARRYWISH, the strongest of us, and the last, except she wasn't. I always know WHITH to find CARRYWISH when I want her. No one can mistake the call of mourning dove. CARRYWISH came so hard on PENNYDANCE that I asked Matt once if she and Pat had planned it that way or if they hadn't. Matt didn't answer yes or no, but she smiled as at a long-agone fair memory, and said, "Pat and I were so happy to find Blue Flower we would have liked to have birthed a dozen children one after another, as quick as could be. But then, what would their poor Matt, my second helper, have done?" And she squeezed my hand. We talked of this shortly after FONDEST and RIGHTFUL were birthed. Matt knew I'd been planning on scribbling and that I felt more Sibs had thwarted me. CARRYWISH is incapable of thwarting anyone. I've never once had a worry about her, not ever. She's more of a doer than a sayer, and she never mossy gathers about her tasks, and it never seems to occur to her to wish to be doing something different. She never eats or drinks much of it, but she seems to love the bread and wine that she helps to fash as if they were her children, and she is as proud to offer them to the rest of us as any Matt could be on presenting her latest birth to the world. What could she smell like but fresh-baked bread and wine afore it's left to age? She has soft yellow hair and brown eyes, and her wearing cloth color is deep red, same as her feet are from trampling out the grapes account of the juice never quite washes off. Her special bespringing things are deep red too, the passion flowers that grow close to the base of the sancti mount. Those flowers are about how I came to know about her elsewhere story, account of though she never lies, she doesn't necessarily feel she has to say everything she knows either. But before I get to that, I need to say that CARRYWISH is deserving of her name. More than that, she is her name. My veriest belief is that she carries all the rest of the fam around with her, like she does the bread and wine, and maybe others outside the fam as well. Carries not just our wishes, but everything we are, our very selves. And she doesn't seem to feel burdened at all, to be able to be the bearer of bread and wine, which, along with FONDEST's water and RIGHTFUL's oil, are the most portentous things for the fam's feeding. What is chasing after stray mornin' dews to that? And what is chasing younger Sibs to carrying everyone's heart so close to you that you can't tell a beat of them from your own? I've never had to chase CARRYWISH, mind, but she carries me and my tasks too. If she didn't, I'd mossy gather 10 times worse than I do anyway. What led me to hearing CARRYWISH's elsewhere story was PENNYDANCE's. I knew that CARRYWISH's particular bespringing things grew near the sancti mount, and after hearing PENNYDANCE I thought I should warn CARRYWISH about the man in the cave. I asked her if PENNYDANCE had told her of him. "She's told me," said CARRYWISH, "but I already knew. I talk to him myself every mornin'-wise, and bring him a sheaf of grain and a flour." This took some time to sink into my head. When I'd cripped the portentousness of it, my head shook, not angrily, for I was past that. I almost felt like laughing. I said, "Seems like the Sibs I'm supposed to be in charge of are more in charge of me than the vice versa. Next thing FONDEST will tell me she's swum the sea, and RIGHTFUL will tell me he's found the most perfect olive tree for oil on the other side of the sancti mount, and Mariago might tell me almost anything without surprising me." CARRYWISH answered in her gentle way, "It's good that we're not your tasks specially, but you seem to feel that means we can't be our own tasks as well. But we are, you know, just as you're ours." There was nothing I could say counter to that, so I said, "CARRYWISH, let's sit together a bit. and we can have some of that bread you're carrying, and you can tell me how you met the man in the cave and everything that followed." This is what she told. "I was looking for the best flower to put in my hair that day, and I saw him at the mouth of the cave. Not outside at all. He can't come out. I think it was the smell of the bread I carried that brought him. I wasn't afraid of him. I knew he wasn't Pride Child, or if he once was, he wasn't any more. And Mourning Dove liked him. Dove always knows, just like Match does. I walked close, so close that I could almost have handed him my loaf of bread. I could see by the look in his eyes that he was hungry, so I stepped even closer and held the loaf out to him. He shook his head, stepped back out of my reach, and said, 'Too good for the likes of me. Only thing I eat is cave moss. Bread's too good for the likes of me.' 'Well, if you can't eat bread, can I give you some wine?' I asked. A shudder seemed to run all through him. 'Not now. Maybe not ever. I drink all the water I can along with my bit of cave moss. Water thins the blood. My blood's still way thicker than it should be. What that came from, there was too much of it. They even talked me into drinking it once. I thought maybe it would be a brave thing to do, but it was the most Pride Child thing I'd ever tasted. I spat it out, and they made me lick it up again. I asked him who they were and what they'd come from. 'Up north,' he said, pointing that way but not looking. 'Crooked town, castle twisted, like in the verse.' He must have seen the wonder on my face, account of before I could speak again he nodded and said real solemn, 'I know the verse. I know it better than my own name.' But that talk of blood had made him start brining, and he went back into the cave with I couldn't see him, and that was all I heard from him for that time." At the mention of the man's name, I thought to interrupt. "PENNYDANCE says his name is Charter. Is that what he told you, CARRYWISH?" CARRYWISH frowned thoughtfully and answered, "No, he's never told me that, though now I come to think on it, there is something a little Charter-like about him. But he's only told me to call him the cousin, account of he's kin to our fam somehow. I can't crib how that could be. But what else has this cousin told you?" "He's told me there are tunnels leading all the way from the Castle Twisted down to the Sancti Mount. He says he didn't come HITH that way, but he ought to have. He's not rightly sure how he did come, but the people below, PENNYDANCE told you about them, came that way. He can hear them muttering and cursing down thith, and he recognizes a lot of their voices. He says they seem to be hungry and thirsty all the time. He says he's tried trickling down some flood water, but that makes them mutter and curse worse than ever. I said maybe they need some bread to go with it. He said if you could get it to them they would try, but they say it's not fit for human consumption." "If they won't eat bread," I asked, "what will they eat?" The cousin hesitated to answer, but at last he said, "When they say human consumption, they mean it. They eat each other. You can guess what it is they drink." Now part of me wanted to hear no more of this, but somehow I knew it was portentous that I should, and I could see that though the cousin didn't want to tell me, he needed to tell me. I thought maybe it would make it easier if I asked a question about the doxology of it. What do they do when they've eaten and drunk each other all up? They spit each other out, reform themselves, and start all over again. Could I try, I asked, to give them some bread, though? Maybe they'd take it from someone they didn't know. He said I could try, but I couldn't come into the cave account of it wasn't fit for the likes of me. He said there's a narrow hole leading down into the tunnels, where the ground is loose from conifer burying our ashes. No one knows what con buries his ashes. The cousin didn't know it either, but he told me about the ashy place, and I figured it out. Don't tell Conifer, though. I didn't go looking for it a purpose. The cousin told me what it was and went back into the caves as though he couldn't bear to look while I was trying. I went to the ashy place and dropped a hunk of bread in. The ashes sucked it up at once. Do you think the below people ate it? No, but they didn't spit it up either, nor did they curse. I thought that might be a good sign, but I've tried again and again, and I'm sure they never eat my bread, nor do they spit it back, and I don't know what they do with it. They spit up other things, though. What kinds of things? You don't want to hear this specially, but you asked. Sometimes it's a finger, sometimes it's an ear, sometimes it's some part of a person's innards, but they only spit up what they eat, and I've told you what they eat. But, CARRYWISH, this is horrible. How can you of all goodness bear it? And why in the name of all sanctiness do you keep trying? In the name of all sanctiness it doesn't seem right not to try. You're the hopefulest one of us specially. You should understand. They might change their minds. They might decide they are sorry, like the cousin is. Something about this made me really want to argue back, especially on account of whoever said I was hopeful. But the cousin won't eat your bread either, I objected. Not yet, but he's getting closer. Other day he said he'd try a bit of unbaked grain to go with his cave moss in floodwater. I brought him a sheaf, and he tried it, and he said it was good. So every morning-wise I bring him another one along with one of my passion flowers. Their color seems to cheer him from the cave darkness, and they don't seem to make him think about blood. That's the one thing you don't want him thinking about. He'll brine and crawl back into the cave, and that's the last you'll see of him for that day, and sometimes more. CARRYWISH's voice dropped to a whisper. One time the subject of blood came up through no direct mention of mine. I asked the cousin once if the below people wouldn't eat bread, they might try to get down a little wine. He shook his head violently and fearfully, over and over, and cried out, "Oh, no, not wine. Don't try. They would never drink that. Not wine." I was wondering whether to ask him how he knew, but I didn't need to. He told me that once he'd had either a dream or maybe a vision about the below people, but whichever it was definitely an elsewhere story, so I might want to give it some credit. He said that someone, he couldn't at all see who, it was so much darker down there even than in his cave, but someone had gone down to what the below people themselves were and offered to feed them. I don't know what the someone had to give. Whatever it was, the below people kept refusing it. But finally they muttered back to him, "We'll try a taste of you, though." They couldn't see it all, but it seems that someone must have had a knife or other cutting thing with him. The next they knew, they smelled blood and heard the sound of something wet dripping to the cave floor. The someone had spilled some for them, without being forced to, it seems, and after that they could hear him walking away, blood, if that's what it was, trickling back behind him. It made them mad to let him go, but they couldn't see to follow. That blood smell made them mighty thirsty, though. They got down on the cave floor and felt around with their fingers till they found some fresh, sticky stuff, and they licked their fingers in anticipation of licking the floor. But when they tasted the stuff, they started gagging and cursing and spat it back up again. "Why?" I asked CARRYWISH. "I thought blood was what the people below liked." The cousin says blood's not what they tasted. Then what did they taste? Wine. And as I scribbled that last word of her story, that elsewhere inside of an elsewhere story, I'm shivering like I did when I first heard it without quite cripping why. As I said afore, telling what CARRYWISH told, until the twins came, I'd been planning to start scribbling. I had just learned my letters from Matt, and with PENNYDANCE 5 and CARRYWISH an easy 4, and no more Sibs expected account of there'd never been as many as 4 years between Sibs afore, I thought I could scribble and still do my other tasks. I don't know now just what I thought I knew enough to scribble about at 7 years old, but I was ready to scribble about everything in the world and out of it. Mostly I wanted to scribble about PRESTER, and that hasn't changed. But when I tried to start, I found I spent so much time dreaming about what I wanted to scribble sitting amidst the morning dews that I never wrote more than a few words, and whatever they were are now lost as far as I know. I don't memorial them. Turns out it was a lot easier thing to think about scribbling than to do it, and I was the happiest I think I've ever been. Then one night as I was about to go aloft, Matt and Pat called me apart from the other Sibs to sit with them, and told me the news that 2 more Sibs were coming. I couldn't very well not act happy about that, and of course part of me was, but the other part brined a lot after I'd climbed into the loft. I knew I'd lost scribbling for a long while, maybe for always. But the thing I knew even more clearly was that this news made me pine for PRESTER more than ever. 2 more were coming, twins like PRESTER and me. I knew before any of us saw them that there would be a boy and a girl.
11th Scribble. Fondest and rightful. Water and oil, and they keep me from scribbling. To be exact, they were a girl and a boy. Fondest was birthed first, and Mossy gathered long enough to give Matt a lot of grief. Rightful burst out right afterward in a storm of impatience. If newborns can be said to express visible content, Fondest glowed with it when first she was washed and swaddled. Rightful squalled as if he'd much rather be all over a mess, and he didn't seem to be too pleased at being clothed either. For their first year I was busy helping Matt with them, but I still toyed with the idea of scribbling from time to time. When they started walking, they stayed close to the habitat, account of they weren't weaned yet, and I still thought there might be some hope. Maybe I was the hopeful person CARRYWISH said I was. But after they were weaned and set about the task they were clearly born to at opposite ends of blue flower, scribbling, or any hope of it, farewell. Fondest helps carry water. She can't carry much at a time, but what she lacks in strength she makes up in enthusiasm, and I don't think she's ever spilled a drop. The hard thing is getting her away from the star twin and back to the habitat. She makes more trips than she needs just so she can keep going back to the river. Nothing she loves better than being wet,
At first I fretted terrible over her, account of her and Rightful running off in two separate directions. I think they were born planning it that way. So at first I'd say, just dabble your toes in the twin, Fondest, unless I'm washing you, but don't go further. Then it was, you can't go in past your knees even at the fording place, account of you're not tall enough. Finally it became, just don't drown yourself. She smells like everything that runs or swims or floats in the river. Her particular bespringing things are cattails, though she calls them tail cats. As I've scribbled, we can't tell whose particular bewinged thing is whose with the twins. A kind of black phoebe and spice finch keep flitting back and forth between the two of them. The twins refer to them as if they were a single critter. Black spice finch phoebe, or spice black phoebe finch. If one does belong to one, I expect Match knows which is which, but he's not telling any more than the twins are. Account of their age, even being boy and girl, it would be hard to tell them apart when they were clothed if it wasn't for their hair. They both have Matt's blue eyes, and they both have brown hair. I mean like earth you wish you could eat, not mud like mine. And both their heads of hair seem to want to grow halfway between their chin and their shoulders and go no further. But Fondest's is silky and straight as straight, and when it's wet it's a web of tangles. Rightful's is coarse curls, not loose ones like PENNYDANCE's, but so tight that if you finger one and let it go you can almost hear it celebrating with relief to be back with it belongs. Rightful wouldn't ever get wet if I didn't insist he wash. Not that he is afraid of water, but that it's too clean. Well, maybe clean isn't so much what he objects to. He doesn't have much use for dry dirt or sand that he can just dust off. He likes everything to be sticky like syrup, or slimy like moss, or especially oily like what comes out of Blue Flower's olive press that stands not far from the stone twin. Good thing his task is to help with the oil for the fam, account of he'd be into it all the time anyway. Not only does he run his oily hands through his hair, which makes the curls shine like new polished wood, but I know he lets oil run down the front of him inside his wearing cloth a purpose. I tell him not to waste it like that, account of it's for the fam. He'll hang his head and look ashamed, but the next he's due for a washing I'll swear he's even oilier. Never seems to get it on his cloth, though. His particular bespringing things are the bearberries that grow near the olive press, though he calls them berry bears. His mouth and chin and tongue are always colored, same as they are. Once Rightful got into the oil from head to foot and seemed pretty proud of it. I turned the talking to on that one over to Matt and Pat, and he never did it again. He even said Spice Black Phoebe Finch thought it was a bad idea. He and Fondest have the same wearing cloth color, blue-green or green-blue. Green seems a little stronger in his and blue in hers, though Matt fashions them the same. They're not dyed after making, you crip, but blue and green threads are interwoven so that unless you get real close, you think they were a single color. How Matt has the patience to fashion them like that, I don't know, but PENNYDANCE seems to get more joy than is usual for her out of helping to do it. My every outdoor Sib watching day ends at the Star Twin with the washing of Rightful. Stone Twin water we use for giving to the bespringing things and for other water tasks, but we don't wash ourselves in it or drink from it, account of it runs a bit too cold. One day not long agone, when Match had finally bullied me into starting this scribble, but I hadn't set pen to parchment yet, and I'd washed Fondest and she was clothed again and standing by while I washed Rightful, whom no amount of scrubbing can ever get unoiled, even if it can get him unslimed and unstickied. Rightful, whose back I was working on, was facing westward over the Star Twin. Suddenly he said to Fondest, "Did he teach you to swim today?" "Yes, he did," Fondest answered. She beamed. "I went all the way in." Rightful slapped his bare thighs and said, I knew it, account of he got me to go in today too. Only halfway, though. It was mighty cold. I was only half minding all this, thinking it was one of the twins' 5-year-old romances that they conspire at together, till I suddenly remembered that Fondest, even before I had washed her, had already been drenched from head to toe, and Rightful, as I washed him, didn't seem quite as messy as usual from the waist downward. "Who's this he you two are talking of?" I asked. They looked at each other as if wondering whether to tell. Then they nodded their heads and said at exactly the same time, "Not this he, those he's." "All right, those he's," I said, still bathing Rightful and still humoring the two of them. "You tell," Fondest said to Rightful. "No, you," he answered. "No, you," she repeated. "No, you." "Fondest," I said, sensing one of those long-spun twin tricks, "as your older Sib, I'm a-ordering you. Now who are these he's, and why did they want you in the rivers?" "They're the watchers of Blue Flower," said Fondest. "One on the far side of each of the twin rivers. They came down HITH to watch like Pat used to at the flood ford, with he found Matt. Same time as the fam came HITH. We can't always see them, but they're always watching, and none but Rightful and I have noticed them yet. I scrubbed the last bit of ooze off Rightful and decided to let him go at that. Get yourself clothed, Rightful. While you're at it, FONDEST is going to tell me the name of this he-watcher west side of the star twin and when she first noticed him. FONDEST is usually a bit shy about telling things, as Rightful never is, but she spoke right up and said, "Noticed him first a few days ago, I guess. His name's Match. Way bigger than your Match, though." At this, Match seemed to be, as they say, all ears, except I'm not sure what his ears are, but he was certainly paying attention. "What do you say, Match?" I asked, helping Rightful pull his wearing clothing over the thickest part of his curls, which is his favorite mossy gathering since he never really wants to dress. "You have any Sibs over thith?" I nodded west. Match surprised me by taking right off from my shoulder and flying so fast over the star twin and back that if I'd been blinking I wouldn't have known he'd been gone. "Sib," he affirmed, licking his wings with his tongue casually, though I could tell he was a bit excited. "Sib it is." A thought suddenly occurred to me. This bigger than my Match wouldn't be the same that Con saw that was sent down by the river and started the fires up north, would it? Match said nothing, but FONDEST and Rightful exclaimed together, "She guessed!" "So," I said, still half playing along, and the other half giving up on not taking their story for solemn, "there's a dragon on the west side of the star twin, and he's taught FONDEST how to swim." "He wanted me to come across to him first day," said FONDEST, "but I only went halfway, account of after that it gets too deep. He asked why I didn't come all the way, and I said I couldn't swim. He asked how I knew, and I said that none of the fam could swim, except maybe Fathom, who I think swims in the sea sometimes, though he never says so. I really wanted to go over to Big Match, though, and I said I would if only I knew how." "Maybe how is something you think a bit too much on," he said. Then he breathed on me. It wasn't painful hot, but it was warm enough to dry in an instant every part of me that wasn't in the water. "Now tell me you can't swim," he said. Next thing I was swimming. I never could figure out how, but it came as natural as to any critter that lives in the water. I swam all the way to the west shore where Big Match was, and I could have come right out on the other side. But Big Match said I mustn't do that. I must stay inside Blue Flower for a while. But someday, he said, I'd follow the river down all the way to the sea. He said by then I wouldn't mind the salt like I do now, and even go over the sea. Not alone, though. "With Rightful?" I asked. "With me?" Rightful asked, looking none too happy. "No," FONDEST smiled. "With Fathom." And Big Match curled one claw around one of my fingers as a bond that it would happen. "Why, what's across the sea?" I asked. "That's what we need to go find out." I couldn't really carry that line of questioning any further, so I turned to Rightful, and in doing so an answer to the question I was going to ask came into my head. "Rightful," I said, "this other he, this east side of the stone twin watcher that came down to guard Blue Flower along of Big Match, he wouldn't by any chance be a bear, would he?" Rightful and FONDEST fairly jumped up and down like they were standing on hot stones. "She cripped!" they chimed together. Rightful said, "Bears get itchy, you know. They need to scratch. Mostly they do it against a tree. But Big Bear had one really itchy spot on his wings." "I may never have seen a bear," I interrupted, "but I've heard of them, and I've never heard of any that had wings." "Big Bear has, though," insisted Rightful, rather offended. "When Con saw him, he didn't," I pointed out. "He's sprouted them since. Anyway, the oil will be a little short today. Account of Big Bear said he had an itch he couldn't scratch, and would I mind coming halfway to the stone twin, and he'd come to the other half, and would I be awfully kind as to put a bit of oil on its itchy spot? So I did, and he was mighty relieved afterwards. He liked the smell of it, too." It occurred to me to wonder whether this whole elsewhere story on the twins' part hadn't been for the sake of explaining that Rightful had spilled some oil, or maybe drenched himself with some. But by now I'd heard PENNYDANCE's elsewhere story and CARRYWISH's, and I'd come to the conclusion that there was way more going on in Blue Flower than I had any idea of. "So the oil is a bit short today because Big Bear had an itch?" FONDEST and Rightful nodded, looking a little worried. "Well, that's a good enough reason," I said. "Matt nor Pat will probably notice anyway, unless that bear's itchy spot was awfully big." FONDEST and Rightful shook their heads, then started jumping up and down again, saying, "We thought you'd be mad. We thought you wouldn't believe us." Gone mad is what I think I must have done, but I believe you. I believe I'm learning way more from the Sibs I've been given care of than they'll ever learn from me. I believe the bell ringer himself must be looking out for you two, for it's a task beyond me. "You're right about that, specially," Rightful blurted out. "And you are downright cheeky," I laughed. The twins looked at each other and laughed too. Then looking back at me, they said together, "There's hope for you yet." 12th Scribble. Now comes match. Not many moons agone, my youngest sib, Mariago, said to me, "Look for something from the Sancti Mount, a benet, particularly for you." Mariago didn't say what was coming from Vith, but she is so close with the Sancti people that I expect she knew. I could never have guessed even close if you'd given me time from the first to the last letter of everything. I was going to call this scribble, "But mine isn't, and now comes match." No, that's not quite right. This scribble wasn't going to be this scribble. It wasn't going to be about match, but about Mariago. And I was going to call it Mariago, so Matt and Pat's fam is complete. But when I started thinking about Mariago, I cripped that it was going to be a way harder scribble than I had thought. I felt I needed a bit of extra help, and Match is good at that. So I decided to write about you first, didn't I, dear blizzardy-winged thing? I know you've been waiting all this time to be told more about. All right, no, you haven't, and right again, I'm probably just mossy gathering. Again, I've always been willing to go near the Sancti Mount when I've needed to, but for some reason I haven't felt comfortable when I'm too close. I expect I ought to be, but I'm not, probably account of I'm not sancty enough myself. I've always liked best looking at the mount from the middle of Blue Flower, which Mariago spends all her daytime. When I've gone all the way west to the sea, the Sancti Mount has seemed too far away to be protecting. But when I go more than halfway back, I feel I need to be protected from it. One thing is, when I'm close, I always feel I need to look for the top of the side tree, just in case there is any, though there isn't. But that means I have to crane my neck all the way backward, and that makes me dizzy when the sun is out. When I go thith at nights with Con and we're looking up at the stars, I never feel that way. Don't know whether it's Con or the stars or both that help me be grounded. But when Mariago told me to look for something from Thith, I cripped that she meant I should actually go Thith and wait for whatever it was for at least a little every day. This was before PENNYDANCE's and CARRYWISH's discovering of the charter man in the cave who is sorry, so I wasn't worried about meeting him. I took to going Thith first thing morning-wise just to get it over, and also for the Sibs were so roused as to make me worry about what they were into. I'd go Thith and spend just a few minutes, and the closer I'd get, the pricklier I'd feel, and I'd look up till my head started to get spin, and then I'd get away from Thith mighty quick. I thought after a few days the prickliness would get less, and maybe the dizziness too, but it was completely vice versa. If too many days had gone by afore something came, I probably would have given it over entirely account of it made me feel I was going to faint or fall down foaming at the mouth like a mad critter. And surely Mariago and the Sancti people, and especially the bell ringer who watches over the mount, wouldn't want that. How many days did I go Thith without anything coming, Match? Well, if you're not telling, I can't memorial, so it must not be portentous. It was no more than a moon's waning and waxing. I'd do memorial that, though I couldn't see the moon during the day, but I'd always take note of it on the eve before going aloft. Then one morning-wise, I went to the mount and was feeling even pricklier than usual, and I started thinking of all kinds of things that I don't often think on, like the lady of Presters' tower, and Pat's mat, and the pride child that had begot Charter, and Pat's Pat, the flood-watcher name of Orion, which I never think of as being Pat's name, even though I know it is. Strangely, I wasn't thinking about Prester himself at all, and seldom's the time he doesn't come into my mind as regular as the turning of an hourglass. I was in more of a hurry to leave than ever, but I knew I needed to look up once at the side tree. I owed it that much reverence at least, even if for only a tip of the head and back. That's what I meant to do. But what I did was turn my eyes all the way upward, and that instant got a crick in my neck. I tried to put my head back with it belonged. I even tried using a hand, then both hands, to help it. But my neck was stuck and had no intention of moving just then. Pretty soon I started to panic, a kind of being dizzier and feeling like I couldn't breathe right in that position. And it actually occurred to me to wonder if anyone had ever gone elsewhere from getting their neck stuck. Probably just about as many as had hair as crazy as mine, which I expect is no one. And on that thought I fell straight backwards and hit my head, not on anything sharp or hard, but on a thick cushion of cave moss that had wandered outside to take some sun. That straightened my neck up, all right, but it also put me fast asleep. I woke up shortly with a bit of a sore neck and back of the head, but nothing too worrying. It was such a relief to be able to breathe straight again, and I kept my eyes closed and did the 14. The sun felt warmer on my face than I would have expected at that time of the day. Then I felt something long and thin and coldish. Slithering isn't right, nor is slinking, nor is creeping. but something moving along the side of my cheek that knew exactly what it was doing, and that something gave me a slap. The sun got suddenly hotter and nearer feeling, but there was also a sudden fanning breeze from some width. I thought maybe I'd died of a stuck neck after all, and I almost hoped I had, account of I wasn't sure I wanted to know any more about that slither slap. But there's a part of me that's always eager to know the worst, so I opened my eyes. Thanks, Match, for being in hover, not in perch mode right then. Account of if I'd opened my eyes and you were perching on me close enough that I couldn't see what you were in any kind of focus, I would have concluded the worst from what I could see and done a feint all over again, and maybe not woken up from that one either. As it is, you were just the right distance above me for me to get a perfect look at you in all your, I can't say beauty or marvel or even oddness, but in all your you-ness. You were, well, I didn't know what you were. You were a lizard, bronzed with black and gold markings, and you had double wings like a dragonfly, copper-tipped with green. I was too surprised, though not scared, strange to tell, to wonder whether you were friend or foe. You set right about putting me at ease, though. You opened your mouth to say something, as it might be greetings, but you must have been thinking in your own language, and that's how it came out. A little blast of fire. Luckily it wasn't aimed at my hair. I laughed. I can't crip why. If you'd actually said greetings, or hail, or how do, I think I would have been suspicious of you, even if I wasn't afraid. I couldn't stop laughing for a while. Then I answered, account of I knew very well what you'd meant. Benet of the day to you, too, whatever it is you call yourself. This didn't come out very polite, but you didn't seem offended. You wouldn't be able to get your mouth around what I call myself, you answered. Do you think you could stand up so I could perch on you and introduce myself properly? I thought at this point I might be dreaming, but I got to my feet and didn't feel much the worse for the unintended nap. I said, "Don't you think you should introduce yourself afore I let you perch on me?" "Can't happen in that order," you answered stubbornly. "Why not?" "'Cause is." I laughed again. "You don't happen to have been sent to torment me by a certain PENNYDANCE, do you? Never mind. Perch on me. Then tell me your name. A version I can pronounce." You took up your place between my left shoulder and my left elbow, which is just about how long you are. Then you slid down to your secondly place between my left wrist and my elbow, so you weren't too close for me to look you in the eye. The end of your tail, from whose slap I did feel a bit of a sting, I'll remind you, curled round the joint of my thumb in a friendly fashion. Name of Match. Match'll do. I raised my eyebrows. Can't be any relation to Con's big Match, surely, or maybe a long way removed from the fam? I mean, you can hardly expect me to call you a dragon, can you? "I've told you what to call me," you said unconcernedly, rubbing an itch off your snout onto my arm. Then you suddenly looked at me, a little unnecessarily sharply, I thought, and said, "You're wondering what use I'll be to you, aren't you?" I hadn't really thought much on it, since I hadn't known you'd meant to stick around. Do you? "I'm your particular bewinged thing," you said. I couldn't tell whether happily or considering whether I was going to be worth it. "Better slow than no. Not what you expected, though, am I?" "'Struth, I haven't expected anything for a long time. Used to look out for this or that kind of bird or flying insect, but gave all that up just like I've given up the thought of scribbling. Come to think of it, if I had still expected anything, it would have been something like you. I didn't know whether I meant that as a mean stone or a welcome, but you didn't seem to notice." "Funny you should mention scribbling," you said nonchalantly, "because in fact I can help you scribble. Go in for a bit of scribbling myself." "How, by dipping your tail in a dish of ink?" You looked disdainfully at me. "I could if I wanted to, but I'm not HITH to scribble. I'm HITH mostly account of your scribbling. If you ever plan to do it, that is," you answered, and started scratching yourself against me again. "Stop that, Match. Your scratching makes me itch. As for scribbling, well, I thought I'd given it up, but I might always be badgered into changing my mind. Anyway, why should I believe that you know letters, except that you say so, of course? If you're not going to take what I say for just that, maybe I can't be of use to you after all. Maybe I should be finding out whether you know your letters. What's AH spell?" "Ah." "LA? La." "DEE? D." "DO? Do." "OH? Oh." "DAY? De. Hold on, how do you know Matt's lullaby?" "It's the sort of thing I know anyway, but all the sancty folk know that. They hold it in very high esteem. Sing it regular, they do, like Browl does." I thought to say, "You know Browl?" But after what else you'd said, even I could see this was a perfectly silly question. I wasn't going to give in yet, though, so I said, If you can spell and know so much, what's the first letter of the first line of the verse? T, you shot back before I could get the whole word out. I was startled by this, but I wasn't going to show it. The last letter of the last lot, R. That would be the last line as you know it. I know more of it than you do. I can't tell you any of the rest yet, not till only then and then only. But if you've still got doubts, the third line from the last one is about wings. Not wings like mine, white wings. I was speechless for a minute at least. I felt like my neck might have got stuck again. Finally I said, well, Match, I'll have to think more on the scribbling thing if I do decide to do it. It'll be nice to have help. Any case, it's time we were headed back to the habitat to gather some sibs and tame some morning dews. I don't suppose you can help with that, can you, short of setting them all on fire? That's pretty much the way we've been talking to each other ever since, isn't it? Like an old Matt and Pat that seem to have been around each other for way too long, except that it's for their own good. I did say something solemn to you at the end, though, didn't I? I said it was nice at last to have a particular bewinged thing, and so it is, even if you won't let me rest from this scribbling for more than a beat of your wings. "13th Scribble. Something in my head makes me start. Specially is a mossy gatherer, specially is a mossy gatherer. I know, Match. I'm supposed to be scribbling about Mariago. I tried last scribble and I couldn't get thith, nor can I still get thith. Account of, she's the last thing I know to scribble about, unless something else comes, and I'm not sure I want to. Mariago, she could talk when she first opened her eyes, you know. She told me afore you came that I could scribble now, account of she really was the last sib. I'd so resigned myself to not scribbling by then, it seemed too much of an effort to unresign, so that didn't make me start. And she told me you would come, and you did, and that didn't make me start either. I haven't been the veriest I could have been about what did start me. I've made it sound like I made up my own mind after getting the benet of the fam and lastly you. I mossy gathered then, as I am doing now. Don't memorial how long you badgered me, and I had an itch that wasn't quite bad enough to scratch. A few moons at most. Then Muddyhead caught up with me. Though Mariago told me I could start, though you told me I should start, I'm not sure I ever would have if it hadn't been for Muddyhead, who is way worse company than Morning-Dew Head. If I hadn't learned to do a task despite Morning-Dew Head, I never would have done one yet. One day, I was at the center of Blue Flower with you and Mariago and Hummingbird and Mariago's particular bespringing thing, but I can't tell about her yet, and my head started aching. Awful. And I got dizzy, and my eyes started blurring. She was telling me her wedding news, as she does every day, and suddenly my head seemed to come unwedded from the rest of me. Next thing I memorial, I was in the healing room. Don't know who in the fam brought me thith, maybe all of them. Can't tell about the healing room yet, account of that belongs to Mariago's scribble. But thith I was, with Matt beside me, and she was cooling my brow from fever. I had such a scorcher that Match might have lit it himself, and my head was so not wedded to anything but mud, I was telling things I would never otherwise tell. I want to see the stars under Prester's tower, before I go elsewhere. I want to go back to what Prester and I were born. I'm dying, aren't I, Matt? I've got to see first. I've got to scribble. Don't know how long that went on, but it eased eventually. Matt was tending me as only Matt can, and I asked her what was happening to me. She said maybe it had something to do with getting ready to start the bleed, account of I was about that age and it can turn your whole body vice versa. I'd known about the bleed for a while, something that happens to women folks so they can be Matts. I didn't pay much heed when Matt first told me, account of I'd already decided I wasn't going to be a Matt. I couldn't imagine ever being done with the younger Sibs, but even when I was done, I couldn't imagine any Pat coming along for me as good as my own Pat, or as fine as Con, or as right as Prester, the last of which goes without being spoken. But one day Matt asked me whether there was any sign of the bleed yet, and I said no, none, and in saying that I realized I was scared of it. And once I started getting scared, I went on getting really scared on account of what happened to Matt. But that comes in Mariago's scribble. But as I was lying thith in the healing room, and Muddyhead had backed off some, and Matt was singing me her lullaby, which I think the healing room itself would sing if no one else was thith to do it, I asked her, why do I have to have the bleed if I'm not going to be a Matt? She said, same reason as menfolk are able to be Pats without ever actually being them, which is to say, specially, I don't know. But why is it you are so sure you won't be a Mat? I know about no Pat being as good as Prester, but what if someone almost that good was to come from across the Twin Rivers, a-courting you? It might happen. Pat and Charter and Fathom and Con could coax it to happen, if you were willing. But I think you've got another reason you haven't told me. Mat, I whispered, account of it sounded vainty to say it out loud. When Marigot tells me her wedding news every day, she talks about wedding as though it was everyone wedded with everyone. I crip wedding in particular, like I crip particular bespringing things and particular bewinged things. But if I were to wed with one, wouldn't that mean I'm leaving all the other ones? Not that it would be pride child, but somehow I feel I don't want to. When I'd said that, Muddy had started to come on again. Any case, I felt like I couldn't see Mat's face very well, but I heard her voice. That's the most beautiful there is for a lady, unless it's some lady I haven't met yet. And I could hear that she was brining a little. When I was 12 like you, and the bell ringer took me above from Prester's tower, I heard the very thing you're telling me in his own voice, and I knew that no voice could make me fall in love the way his did. I decided then that I wouldn't leave anyone out, unless they insisted on being left. That was my choice, but then something happened I didn't choose, and I had to decide differently. If you make up your mind to do your scribble, and you come to the end of what you know, I'll tell you why that was. But now you need to rest. I know you're anxious to go back aloft with the other Sibs. Aloft's not all it's meant to be when anyone's left out. Muddy had let me sleep then, but I knew it wasn't gone for good. I knew if I didn't start now, I'd never scribble. I knew if I didn't come as close as I could to seeing the stars under Prester's tower afore Muddyhead, or the bleed, or whatever it was got the better of me. Well, it's not as if I was going to start scribbling after I'd gone elsewhere. That's a reason for scribbling that can't scan, that hangs on nothing. There's no doxology in it at all. As PENNYDANCE would say, 'cause was. And as you would say, Match, 'cause is. So here I am, a-scribbling. 14th Scribble. Marigot, or as she would say, and she ought to know, just Mary. When Pat fashed Blue Flower's habitat, along with the rooms below for cooking and cloth fashing, and sitting by the fire and telling stories, and his and Mat's sleeping place, he fashed a healing room. When any of the Sibs is too sick to go aloft, or when Mat was birthing and night nursing the Sibs from PENNYDANCE down, that was a place apart for it, just off Mat and Pat's room. It's with the Sibs sleep till they're weaned and go aloft. It wasn't fashed much afore PENNYDANCE came, so I didn't sleep that long. We all slept with we could till the habitat was done. Mat fashed cloth to hang the healing room in, green, not too dark, nor too light, but like the fairness of all the leaves of all the bespringing things weaved into one. Though you may not be feeling well bodily, your spirit can't feel anything but calm thith. We all retreat to it at times, even if we're not sick, when we're troubled in mind or want to be solitary for a bit. It's never been needed by more than one of us at once, so I think it must have some property of healing just being thith. Account of in a fam of 11, not including Prester, chances are at any time at least 2 of us might be feeling a bit muddy. Don't memorial how many other times I was thith for my own reasons, but I was thith at the birthing of PENNYDANCE and CARRYWISH and FONDEST and RIGHTFUL, and I'm not sure about Marigot. She wasn't birthed quite like the rest of us. Not even sure how much of her is like the rest of the fam, and how much is from elsewhere. Mat weaned Fondest and Rightful a bit early, account of she knew there was another Sib coming, and just as soon as the weaning was done and she was able to put all her strength into the one to come, she knew that something was wrong. She bled sometimes when she hadn't with the others, and she just felt in her inside that things were different than afore, though she couldn't say how. Pat, who's not much given to ordering, ordered her to the healing room for as long as it took, even if it was all the several moons up to the birthing. Didn't take that long. I was thith bringing her some things she needed when it happened. She was feeling good enough to be on her feet for a while, so she was walking slowly about and looking up at the just appearing stars through the sky window, which the healing room has the same as the loft does, and no windows besides. I'd brought her a clean gray wearing cloth, account of her other one needed washing, and she'd washed herself and dressed, and I'd just handed her a dish with a bit of bread and herbs, which was all she had the appetite for, and I was handing her a cup with a few sips of wine. Cup never made it into her hand, account of I dropped it. All over the front of her clean cloth, like a burst from a fountain, there was blood. Just that sudden, and already it was dripping from the cloth to the floor. I yelled for Pat, who had just come in from his tasks, and I yelled for all the Sibs in birth order, and I helped Matt to the healing room bed again. By the time I got her the few steps thith, there was blood all over me, so it made my cloth color look as purple as PENNYDANCE's, and afore half the Sibs had arrived, FONDEST and RIGHTFUL weren't allowed in, there was blood all over the bedcloths. I think the bell ringer must have told the sun to sleep longer that night than usual. I memorial no night that long afore or since. Pat was trying to be brave, but he was in tears, and so were the rest of the Sibs. All except me. I couldn't brine. I was too scared. I was too full of horror at the sight and smell and feel of blood. I couldn't think about Matt dying or living, or me dying or living either. For some reason, except for the bleeding, all I could think about was Prester. I've always thought about Prester as living in the healing room in a way, even though I know he's elsewhere. I looked up at the sky window, and what should I see but the 7 Sibs and Prester's star among them. "Save Matt, Prester," I asked in my head, which had nothing of morning dew in it at that moment. "Ask the bell ringer. Tell him he can take me elsewhere instead of her. Save Matt." Next thing I noticed was that the Sibs' voices and Pat's had changed. Then I heard Matt's voice say, clear as clear, "Prester." I was afraid to look anywhere except the sky window, but I had to. Pat and the Sibs were still brining, but they were smiling in a kind of disbelief, too. Matt's eyes were open, and she was trying to sit up, though she was too weak. She said, "I could eat some bread and herbs now, and drink a little wine. Specially brought me some. With especially." I brought her another plate of bread and herbs. The first one had long been lost in the brining and the blood, and I brought her another cup of wine, more than a little, account of I was pretty sure she needed it. I'm not sure if she cripped then what had happened to her or not, though she came to after a while. But whether she knew or not, her face was full of more joy and love and beauty than I'd ever thought possible. All of us took it in turns to clean up the healing room, and when we did, it seemed there wasn't as much blood as we had thought. There had been, though. Don't know whit that could have gone. Matt stayed there for maybe another moon, and the longer she stayed, the more solemn she got, though I can't say she seemed exactly sad. One day when I was with her, she brined a little, and said there wouldn't be any more Sibs. I think we all knew that, but it's the first time she'd said it to any of us out loud. Then she asked me to get her the last thing I could have expected. "Could you fetch me my scribbling things specially? I might do a bit afore I go back to all my tasks. Maybe you can do a little bit along of me too." I didn't, though. As soon as I brought her scribbling things, she was deep in thought and scribbling away. I don't think she noticed when I left the healing room to go aloft. After that, the healing room had no one that needed it again for a time. One day Matt and I were giving it a regular clean. She seemed to want to linger there, wistful-like, though I could tell she tried not to. And the sun was coming through the sky window, and it suddenly shone on something about the size of Gerfalcon's eye, floating like a mote of dust. But at that size it should have been too heavy to float. Gerfalcon saw it and went for it and put it in my hand. Mine, not Matt's. I don't crip why. I can't tell you what it was, account of it was nothing like either of us had ever seen, but it was roundish, though not perfectly round, and it felt more like the case of a seed of some bespringing thing than anything else, and it was white and gray and a little bit blue and maybe even red, but it was hard to focus on, and the light went partly into it, if not through it, and it appeared that something was moving inside it. "Matt," I asked, "what is this?" And I held it out to her. She took it into her hand and looked at it. Then she looked at me with eyes that shone and said in a voice that trembled, "Would you come with me specially to the center of Blue Flower? I've got a task I'd like you to help with." Pat had calculated the exact center of Blue Flower and fashioned above it a set of interwoven arches. It was a quiet place, quiet as the healing room, and it had a planting bed in its midst that Matt had bordered with shells and stones that Fathom had brought from the seashore. The morning dew stayed away from it, which made me like the place well enough. Time went on, though, and nothing was planted thith, and I asked Pat why, and he said to ask Matt. When I did, she said, "Seed hasn't come yet. I'll know it when it does." Matt and I hurried to the planting bed, and Matt got down on her knees, with Gerfalcon still on her shoulder, and somehow the sight of her thith made me brine a bit, though she wasn't brining. She told me to go fetch water from the stone twin, and water from the star twin, equal parts as I could of each. When I came back, the seed was already in the earth, and I watered it, and everything was as still as still. Thing about the center is, it makes you sleepy if you're thith for any amount of time. Even the bewinged things tend to want to sleep thith. Only critter as doesn't is Mariago. Except Match, when he's thith with me, doesn't either. But he does seem to spend all his center time looking worship-like at Mariago's face. Matt said that she thought she'd nap a bit, and she asked me to watch for her. But it was so still and everything was asleep, and pretty soon I couldn't help myself. Don't think I was muddy-headed for too long, but I suddenly came awake feeling like a MISERYME, and thith was Matt, sleeping as peaceful as could be. And in the center of Blue Flower was a blue flower, about 3 foot tall. We have roses in Blue Flower, so I know what they look like, but I'd always heard that there are no blue ones, none really blue, that is. This was a rose, and it was blue, bluer than the morning dews, bluer than my cloth color, bluer than the sky, bluer than pure water. There was only one bloom on it, and it had no thorns. I reached out, trembling, to touch Matt. She woke at once, and at once she saw it. I don't know what she'd expected, but she didn't seem surprised at seeing it thith, or seeing it sprung up so soon. She gave one keen glance, then said she needed to go back to her task at the habitat, but she asked me if I'd take on the task of visiting the rose every day and watering it with twins water and making sure no harm came to it. And if Matt has ever gone thith again herself, none of us know it. Every day I watered the rose, and every day I usually napped a little thith, account of it being a sleepy place. I've already scribbled that the morning dews won't go thith. After the rose, neither would any other sort of bespringing thing, but it didn't seem barren or lonely for all that. The bewinged things came to perch on the arches more than ever, but when they were thith, they were always quiet, if not sleeping, and they never left any droppings. Rain never brought any mud, wind never brought any leaves. It was just the rose under the arches within its border of stones and shells. No other bloom came to the rose, its one never fell, and it never has yet. One day a few moons later, maybe 6 or 7, but about the same time Matt would have been birthing if she hadn't bled, I came to the center not long after morning-wise, as I always did, and brought the water. I knew I needed to get right back to check after my younger Sibs, but like always in that place, I couldn't help closing my eyes. I lay my head on the earth outside the planting bed, which, though nothing grew thith, wasn't too hard nor too soft, but like ground that knew it was meant to be a pillow. I think I dozed dreamlessly a while, but soon I was dreaming of some sound, though I couldn't really see anything except as it were like clouds on a fine spring morning after a rain. I couldn't place the sound. It was closest to a tool being cleaned on a hide strop, the littlest bit harsh, but kind of wet and soothing as well. I didn't feel concerned till a minute later I heard a very small voice say the word Prester. I opened my eyes then, right quick, and next the blue flower there was a dog. I recognized it, though I'd never seen one, a looking and a licking something. I wasn't afeard it would harm the rose. I could see it meant no harm to anything. Crazy dream this is, I thought. Even if my eyes were open, I knew I must be half asleep. Dog turned, looked at me with solemn but friendly eyes, and then it wasn't thith anymore. But what it had been licking it was a tiny girl child, size of one newborn, but no babiness about her face nor her body, and she didn't look like grown folk either. She looked a little like Matt, and a little like Pat, and a little like all the Sibs, and even a little like me, and what's strange, a little like the half of Charter that didn't come from Matt. Most of all she looked like Prester, but even I can't crip what I mean by that. Her eyes were wide open, and I could tell that, spite of her newness, if she was new, she could see everything. Her hair, for she had a deal already, was white, not like elder folks' turn, but like that was its natural color, and her eyes were gray, not like a present storm, but like one that had passed by, never to come again. I wasn't sure if I was awake or asleep, but I knelt thith looking at her, like Matt had knelt when she was planting the rose seed. She looked back at me with those gray eyes, and she smiled like she'd had a lot of practice at it, and she said, yes, she said, perfectly clearly, though in a tiny voice, "Specially." Like a dream continuing, I picked her up, wrapping her in my own wearing cloth as best I could, account of she had none of her own, and went back to the habitat, not meeting a soul on the way, and I walked right into the healing room with I knew Matt would be, and this she was. Matt took her from me, smiled, and said, "Mariago," and began nursing her. No one of the fam ever asked whith she came from. It was as if the Sib Matt had lost had come unlost. I seem to be the only one that wonders whether she is Fam or isn't, and even I don't wonder in a worried sort of way. She looks like Prester, and that's comfort enough for me. Marigot talked plain when she was as new, and no one seemed to wonder at that either, or that the things she said sounded as though she knew more than any of the rest of us ever will. Mat chose white for her wearing cloth color, which as far as I crept has never belonged to anyone but the lady of the tower. After she'd been weaned and gone aloft, not long afore Match came to me, Marigot started spending her daytimes in the center of Blue Flower, near the flower it seems she sprang from, and I can't think that she'll have any other task, just like I can't see her getting any taller than the rose is now. First day she went thith, her particular bewinged thing, Hummingbird, came from somewhith and lighted on her shoulder. No need to tell you what her particular bespringing thing is, couldn't be anything except the blue rose itself. She smells like the rose, and I've got no words to tell you how that is. As I've said, she doesn't get sleepy at the center. She's widest awake thith anyway. And that's with she tells me her wedding news. When I can stay awake, that is. First news I ever heard from her was to look for something from the Sancti Mount. Second news was she'd been in a wedding the night afore. She didn't say a wedding, she said the wedding, like there was only one, and like she'd been going thith a long time already. I should have been surprised that Marigot knew what a wedding was, but it seems she knows everything. The doxology, or maybe the poison stink, or pride child part of me, couldn't help asking anyway. How do you know it was a wedding? She looked at me with what would have seemed like scorn on any other face, but on hers it wasn't. Cloak casting, you know, like in Pat's GRANDFAM, and feasting after. I don't think she's ever been told about the cloak casting, so I let that pass and asked, at this wedding, who was being wed to whom? She frowned as though it was a question that couldn't scan, and answered, everyone, of course. Everyone? I can't crip what that means. So everyone is casting their cloaks around each other and being wed with each other all at the same time? Yes, she brightened, though it isn't exactly like that, and Bellringer casts his cloak over all. The Bellringer was at this wedding? Of course. How else could anyone be wed? He lets me help serve at table, she said proudly. And he told me first time that my name by rights shouldn't be Marigot, but just Mary. Account of ago means I was Mary, and amped now. But I am and always will be. Fam can keep calling me Marigot if you want, though. Someday you'll learn to say it proper. This elsewhere story of hers, as if she needed another besides how she came to us in the first place, was making my head feel morning dewy, though not sleepy as usual in the center, strange to tell. I was afraid to ask her anything. I cripped she'd tell me what I should hear whether I wanted to or not. She didn't seem inclined to say anything else just then, so to clear my head I asked, "Whit was this wedding?" Not was, is. And with the perfect finger at the end of her perfect arm she pointed straight above. I'd heard too much by now from Matt and Fathom and Con to think she couldn't know what she was saying. Sancti places, I asked. The sanctiest, even sanctier than our Sancti Mount. Is there music thith? You know. Right, Matt's lullaby. And how do you get thith? Does the bell ringer come and get you like he did Matt, or... But she didn't let me finish. She answered, You know. How would I know? You saw him, right HITH, after you heard me say Prester. Big dog. Marigot, you can't memorial that, or maybe you can, but the dog part has to have been a dream. Account of he was on the ground, and things that aren't bewinged, except the fam, can't be on the ground in Blue Flower. Unless, are you going to tell me like Rightful says of Big Bear, that Big Dog does have wings? I don't memorial seeing any. They're not in the usual spot. They're disguised. Disguised as what? She grinned. Big Dog has big ears, really big. I grinned back. And he uses them to fly? Yes, and his tail makes a good rudder when he can memorial not to wag. When he can't, we go round and round and it takes us longer to get to the wedding than usual. All right, so Big Dog flies to sancti places, mostly straight. But what happens at these weddings? I'm not sure what you mean. We feast, and everyone is wedded, and it goes on for always, and everyone is merry like me. Doesn't change too much, but it does change all the time. Account of new guests show up all the time, and everyone is even merrier. But then it seems as if they were always thith. When I'm thith, I feel even more wakeful, but more restful than I am by Blue Rose. You'd like it thith, especially, if you could keep from fretting so much about us Sibs and about Prester. No one thith frets about anything. Everyone is merry, for ever past and ever to come. For about the blink of one of her set of grey-eyed lashes, I thought I might crip. No, crip is too strong a word. But I thought I not only knew what she meant, but felt like I was thith. Then the moment was gone. I sighed and I said, I wish Big Dog would take me to the wedding. I wish Big Dog would take me to the wedding. That was supposed to be the end of Mary Ago's scribble. And that, as far as I knew, was to be the end of the whole scribble, except to say that I'm ending it HITH, account of after I scribbled those words last night, I thought I'd made up my mind that I'd done enough, for a bit anyway. Not that I couldn't always find out what more Matt had to tell, if I decided to take it up again at any point. But I'd found out so many things that I didn't know I knew, scribbling what I did know. I started wondering how I could manage to learn more things to scribble and then learn more things while yet doing it. When Muddy had decided me to start, it never occurred to me that the same question would come up again, only in reverse. If I don't stop now, what if I never can? What if the scribble doesn't have an end? Then I'll go elsewhere before I finish anyway, so I might as well stop sooner as later. And when I'd thought of that, it seemed such a perfect doxology to me, unlike my decision to start in the first place, that I actually grinned to myself. When I looked at Match to see if he was grinning with me, not only was he not grinning, but he said something that sort of worried me. Do you mind if I have the night off? A night off of what? Of perching aloft. But all the Sibs bewinged things perch aloft. What will they think if I come aloft without you? They'll think I'm in some kind of disgrace. And then I thought to ask him, am I? He not only didn't answer, he turned his tail toward me, which I thought was a bit disrespectful. Match, I'm tired, I pleaded with him. It's true you helped me scribble like you said you would, but you must admit it's still me that's doing most of the work. Still no answer. At this I started getting a little angry. All right then, have a night off. Don't come aloft with me. I'll see you morning-wise. And he flew off direction of the side tree which he'd come from, and I went aloft without him. I thought, well, at least there is one night he can't make me dream about what comes next. And I didn't. I didn't dream about anything. First time ever in my life, and it scared me more than the thought of the bleed. I felt like I'd wandered off into the night with no stars and become nothing. So first thing morning-wise I went out looking for him, but casually, like I didn't want him to know I cared whether I found him or not. First one I met, though, wasn't Match. It was Mary Ago. Prester was at the wedding last night, she said. My surprise at hearing that news was dampened a bit by suddenly wondering why Prester hadn't been thith afore. I tried not to show I was befuddled and said, Prester? Veriest? I wasn't fooling her one bit. He couldn't get thith afore, though he was invited, but he kept feeling he couldn't celebrate just yet, account of he was being so grieved for. By whom? Who would spare a tear for brining if they thought it'd keep Prester from the wedding? I still wasn't fooling her. You didn't know, she said, though maybe you ought to have. Anyway, after 12 years agone, Bellringer finally told Prester last night enough was enough. Come to the wedding anyway. So he did. And he helped me with the serving. And he had something to say to you. What did he look like? She smiled. I don't know how to tell you, but don't you want to know what he said? Prester is the beginning and the end of my life. In spite of that, the real answer was no. But I couldn't say no to Prester, and Mary Ago knew that. He said, you don't have to keep scribbling. He said if you do, if you go on to find out more and start scribbling about that, your headaches will get worse. So Prester is telling me not to scribble any more? I was coming to the same conclusion. He can't tell you that, nor can Matt or Pat or the other Sibs either. Well, that's a lot of help, I grumbled. HITH I am at the end of it all, and no one can tell me whether it is the end of it all, or will tell me. Match won't either. What is that little lizard, I wonder? Prester says Bellringer's given you your freedom, but headaches will get worse if you do keep scribbling. Does that mean if I don't keep scribbling, Muddyhead will leave me alone? I can't tell. So freedom means I've got to decide without knowing what comes of it? I found myself spitting the words. I don't want freedom if it means I'm not given a reason to crip what to do next. It's what Bellringer gave you. Sorry. Now you sound like PENNYDANCE. Sometimes PENNYDANCE crips more than you do. I am sorry, though. The question you need to ask yourself is whether it's worth it to keep scribbling. whatever comes of it, whether Muddy Head gets worse or goes away, whether what you want to crip that you don't already is something you want to crip or not. Prester told me to tell you that, so I'm telling you, and that's all I can tell you. That was neither the answer I wanted to hear from her, nor the question I wanted to answer for myself. But I brooded on it all that day and all that night as well, under the bell ringer's stars, near CARRYWISH's bespringing things, looking up at the side tree, and wondering whether Match had given me up, and how it seemed strange that none of the fam had come looking for me. I'd never felt so alone in my life, but it wasn't the horrible kind of alone that I'd had the night before with no dreams. I had wondered, I wish Big Dog would take me to the wedding to be the ending. Account of it wasn't one I could crip. But is it worth it? Didn't sound like any kind of an ending at all. Worth it to whom? Prester seemed to be doing all right without me now, and he was the one I thought I was scribbling for. Or was it just me I'd been scribbling for? Had I scribbled account of not scribbling, I felt like the charter that isn't charter, all shut in a cave and not able to get out, or like the below people who have trapped themselves account of they won't do anything, won't, not can't, do anything, account of they can't decide to do something? Freedom meaning doing without cripping what will become of it? Well, that did make me want to spit, even if I couldn't decide to do anything else. It didn't seem fair, as Pat's GRANDFAM would have said. But Matt's GRANDFAM meant something different by fair. What would they have thought? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is it worth... And I couldn't stay awake any more. I knew I'd have to answer that question morning-wise. And when I woke, FITH was Match, looking at me like he had looked when I first saw him. And I wondered if I hadn't dreamed everything since. I was kind of hoping that was the case, account of then I wouldn't have to answer the question. But then I'd have to decide again to start scribbling to begin with. And when I got back to this point, I'd still have to answer the question. I began to think Muddy Head getting worse wasn't the worst thing that could happen to me after all. "15th Scribble. And off I scribble." That was what I was going to call my last scribble, if it was the last. And now I think it's a perfectly silly thing to call it, account of what else is there to say but the end. Like in my first scribble, scribbling about scribbling instead of telling something even I want to hear. More than that, though, things got a little more solemn after scribbling that last bit. Who should come along to the place under the side tree which I'd been sleeping and just woken but Matt? And she had some kind of parchment in her hand. "Mornin', Matt," I yawned. "Might be good to get my mind off my own for a while." "Yes, specially. It's a scribble you haven't read yet. No one has. I wrote it 3 years ago in the healing room. You brought me the things to do it with, and even I haven't read it over since. Time has come to give it to you, which is what I've always meant to do. You don't have to read it, though." "Why wouldn't I want to read something you'd—" "Wait, Matt. It's the next part of my scribble, isn't it? Don't give it to me till I decide to go on. I haven't decided yet." "Keep it for me anyway, specially. It's your story now whether you choose to read it or scribble it or not." "Do I have to take it?" "Yes." That at least was plain speaking. Then she turned to go back to the habitat. "Matt, wait. Do you know whether it's worth it?" There was no need for me to tell her what I meant. "I think I do, but I can't tell surely. I can tell you that's the right question, though." And she left me alone with you, Match. That was it. She and Mariago agreeing. Would all the rest of the bell ringer's creation agree if I could ask it and him? Even if they did, that still didn't give me the answer. Seems there wasn't any answer this side of elsewhere. "Well, Match," I said to you, account of having no one else to say it to, "is there one? That you can tell, I mean. Can you help me, Match? Will you help me?" As simple as that. You preening your tail proudly over and over again and stopping just long enough to ask, "With's a dish of ink?"